Section 1. The World Beneath the World. There is something genuinely unusual about the Pokemon universe. Not unusual in the way fantasy worlds are usually unusual, with their dragons and magic systems and ancient prophecies handed down through centuries of dusty scrolls. Pokemon is unusual in a quieter, stranger way. It sits right at the edge of something it refuses to say out loud. It gives you just enough of a shadow to know something is standing behind it, and then it turns off the lights. You know the feeling. You are 10 years old, or you are supposed to be, because every protagonist in these games is 10 years old, and you have just been handed a small electronic device called a Pokédex and told to go catalog the natural world. This is your mission. This is your purpose. A kindly old professor with white hair and a lab coat has given you a creature in a ball, and off you go, out into the tall grass, with no map, no money worth mentioning, and a father who is apparently not home. You do not think about that last part much when you are young. You are too busy catching things. But the older you get, the more you start to notice what is sitting in the corners of the screen. The shadows underneath the story. The Pokemon franchise has been alive for nearly 3 decades now. It started in 1996 with 2 cartridge games released on the original Game Boy in Japan, Red and Green. 2 colors that would eventually become the first language of an entire generation of children around the world. Since then, it has grown into something genuinely enormous. Movies, an anime that ran for more than 1,000 episodes, trading cards that parents still sometimes accidentally step on in the living room, and generation after generation of games that keep deepening the world, adding new regions and new creatures and new layers of mythology. And with that mythology came the theorists. The fans who started asking questions. Not just casual questions, not just things like, how do you catch Mew, although there were plenty of those too, but deeper questions, philosophical ones. Ones that the games themselves seem to invite. Why are all the fathers gone? What really happened in Lavender Town? Is the thing inside your Pokeball actually comfortable? Who is Ash Ketchum, really, and how is it possible that he has been 10 years old for 30 years? The theories that came out of the Pokemon community are some of the most creative, most emotionally affecting, and sometimes most quietly disturbing in all of gaming fandom. They grew up in school hallways and on early internet forums, and in the comment sections of fan wikis at 2 in the morning. They circulated like folklore. Some of them were so well constructed, so genuinely clever, that they felt more like official lore than anything the games themselves had confirmed. Some of them turned the happy, sunlit world of Pokemon inside out and showed something much darker underneath the surface. Tonight, we are going to go through all of them. We are going to take our time. We are going to move slowly through each one, examining the details, feeling the texture of the evidence, sitting with the implications. There is no rush here. This is the kind of content that was made for quiet nights, for the hour when the rest of the world has gone still, and you are the only one left awake, and the only light in the room is whatever screen you are watching this on. The Pokemon universe is not just a children's game. It never really was. It is a world with mythology and war and grief woven into its foundation. It is a world where a small creature, wearing its dead mother's skull on its head, wanders the desert, crying at the moon every single night. It is a world where a ghost-type Pokemon with the word Shadow in its classification stands at exactly the same height and has exactly the same silhouette as a fairy-type Pokemon with a perpetual smile. It is a world where a Pokédex entry written for a balloon Pokemon, a balloon, something children bring to birthday parties, quietly mentions that it steals children and brings them to the afterlife. None of this is accidental. Whether Game Freak intended every single one of the connections that fans have drawn over the years or not, the world they built is one that rewards attention. The more you look, the more there is to find. So get comfortable. If you are in bed, settle in. If you have headphones on, let the sound fill the space around you. Pull up whatever blanket is nearby. We are going to take a long, careful walk through the theories that have defined the Pokemon fandom for generations, and we are going to do it the slow way, the thorough way, the way that feels like sitting around a fire, while someone who has thought about all of this for a very long time just talks. There is no hurry. There is nowhere else to be. Before we get into the theories themselves, there is something worth saying about why fan theories exist at all, because it is not simply boredom or obsession, although those can certainly accelerate the process. Fan theories exist because fiction, when it is made with genuine love and care, always contains more than its creators could ever fully articulate. The world of Pokémon is built from thousands of small decisions: the color of a Pokémon's shiny form, the specific wording of a Pokédex entry, the placement of a grave in Lavender Town, the team composition of a rival character in a specific battle. Most of those decisions were made by developers trying to build something fun and functional. But sometimes those decisions, stacked on top of each other and viewed from just the right angle, form something that looks like an intentional message. Something that looks like a hidden truth. The fan theory community picked that up immediately, and they have never let it go. Some of these theories have been confirmed, or as close to confirmed as these things get. Some have been officially denied by developers, which in the fan theory world somehow only makes them more interesting, because official denial just means you have to read the denial more carefully. And some of them exist in that perfect ambiguous middle space where no one can say for certain, where the evidence is real, but the conclusion is a matter of interpretation, and where you are free to believe whatever version of the story sits most comfortably in your mind. Those are the ones we love the most, the ones that cannot be fully resolved, the ones that change how you think about everything you already know. Before we move into the first theory, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment down below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. There is something genuinely wonderful about the idea of people all over the world settling in with this at completely different hours, in completely different places, with completely different versions of this franchise living in their memories. Maybe you grew up with the Game Boy games in the 90s. Maybe the first game you ever played was on the DS. Maybe you know Pokémon entirely through the anime, or the trading cards, or Pokémon Go. Whatever your entry point, you are part of this story too. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, slow, thorough, built to send you to sleep, then subscribe, because there is a lot more where this is coming from. Section 2. The Ditto-Mew Connection, a study in failed science. Let us begin with one of the oldest, most elegant, and most persistently fascinating theories in the entire franchise. Ditto is, on the surface, one of the simplest Pokémon ever designed. It is a small, amorphous blob, vaguely purple, vaguely pink depending on the light, with 2 dots for eyes and a faint suggestion of a smile. It does not have a type-specific attack. It does not evolve. Its base stat total of 288 is spread perfectly evenly across all 6 stats. Every single one of them sits at 48. It is, by the numbers, completely ordinary. Except for one thing: Ditto can transform. Transform is a move that only 2 Pokémon in the first generation have access to naturally. The first is Ditto, the second is Mew, and that is where the theory begins. Mew is, according to the Pokédex, the ancestor of all Pokémon. The entry in Pokémon Red and Blue describes it as containing the genetic code of every single Pokémon in existence, which is what allows it to use any move, any TM, any HM in the game. It is the foundation species, the original genetic template from which every other creature on the planet supposedly descends. And it is deeply, profoundly rare, so rare that in the original games, it did not appear in the wild at all. You could only get Mew through a glitch or through an official Nintendo event, both of which felt almost sacred in the mid-1990s. Now, here is the question the theory asks. If Mew is the genetic ancestor of all Pokémon, why is Ditto, this completely ordinary-seeming blob, the only other creature that can perform the same transformation ability? The theory goes like this. The events of the first Pokémon games take place in the shadow of a scientific project that is referenced in the game's background lore, most prominently in the journals scattered through the burned-out ruins of the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. In those journals, scientists describe their years-long obsession with Mew, capturing it in the jungles of Guyana, studying its unique cellular structure, and eventually attempting to clone it. Their goal, as laid out in the entries, was to create the most powerful Pokémon ever conceived, an artificial lifeform built from Mew's DNA but amplified beyond anything nature had achieved. The result of that project, after years of failure and at least one catastrophic incident described in an entry dated February 6th, was Mewtwo. Mewtwo is described in its own Pokédex entry as the most ferocious Pokémon ever discovered, its temperament a reflection of the cruelty of the genetic manipulation that created it. It is Mew, but broken. Mew, but angry. Mew with all of its power magnified and all of its gentleness excised. The theory proposes that Mewtwo was not the only result of those experiments. It was simply the successful one, or the least failed one, because the scientists in the Pokémon Mansion did not get from studying Mew's DNA to creating Mewtwo in a single attempt. Genetic experimentation does not work that way. There were iterations. There were prototypes. There were early attempts at replicating Mew's genetic structure that were not powerful enough, not stable enough, not anything like what the scientists were after. Those early attempts, the theory argues, are Ditto. Think about the evidence. Both Mew and Ditto share the same weight, exactly 8.8 pounds. This is not something that gets mentioned casually in Pokémon discussions, because weight values in the Pokédex are usually just flavoring and nothing more. But the fact that these two specific Pokémon share an identical weight is, at minimum, a strange coincidence. And Ditto's shiny form, which changes it from its usual purplish pink to a light blue-gray, is essentially the same color as Mew's shiny variant. Two Pokémon, one ostensibly wild and natural, one supposedly an ancient mythical ancestor, with identical weights, matching shiny colorations, and the same unique combat ability. The probability of all three being coincidental shrinks with each additional data point. But the most compelling piece of evidence, the one that transforms this theory from an interesting set of coincidences into something genuinely hard to dismiss, is geographic. In Pokémon Yellow, the version of the game that tied most directly to the anime, and which made several intentional changes to the original Red and Blue formula, the locations where Wild Ditto can be found are the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and Cerulean Cave. Those two locations, and essentially nowhere else. In the original Red and Blue games, Ditto was more widely available across various routes, but Yellow specifically concentrated them in those two spots. And those two spots are, within the lore of the game, the two locations most intimately connected to the cloning experiments that created Mewtwo. The Pokémon Mansion is where the research happened. The journals are there. The burned and crumbling rooms are there, a physical testament to what went wrong when the project finally went too far. And Cerulean Cave is the place where Mewtwo retreated after escaping the scientists a deep, dark, labyrinthine cavern that Mewtwo has claimed as its territory, accessible only to the strongest trainers in the game. So, why are Ditto specifically clustered around those two locations? Why does the amorphous shape-shifting blob haunt the ruins of a scientific facility and the lair of a successful Mew clone? The theory says the answer is simple. Because Ditto belongs there. Because Ditto came from there. Because Ditto are the prototypes, the failed experiments, the iterations that did not become Mewtwo but could not simply be discarded either. There is something quietly devastating about this reading of the character. If Ditto is a failed clone of Mew, then its entire existence is defined by incompleteness. It has enough of Mew's genetic material to transform, to temporarily become any Pokémon it encounters, but it cannot hold those forms permanently. It cannot quite become what it was trying to be. It shifts and copies and mimics, but it always reverts. It is always fundamentally a blob, an approximation. A creature that got close but never made it. The scientists wanted Mewtwo. They made Ditto by accident. And Mewtwo, furious, powerful, fully realized in its awful way, does not even know those small, gentle, constantly transforming Pokémon are scattered around its home. Some additional texture on this theory. Both Mew and Ditto are genderless, which in the world of Pokémon means they cannot produce eggs through normal means. Both of them have the unusual ability to breed with almost any Pokémon in the game, regardless of egg group, which makes Ditto one of the most functionally important Pokémon in the entire franchise if you care about breeding mechanics. Mew, as the genetic ancestor of all Pokémon, theoretically contains all genetic information. If Ditto is an early attempt to replicate that structure, it makes sense that Ditto would inherit that breeding compatibility not because Ditto evolved into a creature with that ability, but because the scientists who built it were trying to replicate the genetic universality of Mew, and they got that part mostly right. The base stat parallelism is worth dwelling on for a moment longer. Mew's total base stat score is 600, perfectly distributed 100 inches each of the 6 categories. Ditto's total is 288, which is less than half, but its distribution is also perfectly even 48 inches each category. If you were building a creature by trying to replicate Mew's DNA and your attempt was only partially successful, you might expect exactly this result. A similar structure, but scaled down, less potent, less developed. The shape of Mew in miniature, trapped in an amorphous body that can mimic anything but cannot quite become it. In 2016, the series producer Junichi Masuda gave an interview in which he stated that Ditto is its own unique living being, not a clone of anything. He said each Pokémon is an individual entity. Fans, predictably, received this as something between a polite dismissal and an almost suspicious overcorrection. Because the thing about this theory is that even if Game Freak never intended it, the connections are so numerous and so specific that they create their own logic. The weight, the shiny colors, the transformability, the geographic placement in yellow, the genderless breeding universality, the scaled-down stat mirror. Masuda can say what he likes, but the game already told its own story. And the story says something went wrong in that mansion on Cinnabar Island, and what went wrong is still out there, wandering the ruins, changing its face. There is one final detail that deserves mention, and it is the one that tends to leave a mark on people when they first encounter it. In the original Pokémon movie, the first theatrical film, Mewtwo creates clones of Charizard, Blastoise, and Bulbasaur. He demonstrates, on screen, that the technology to duplicate Pokémon from DNA exists and works. That same film shows Mew the original confronting its copy. And in that confrontation, there is a moment that the movie frames as profound. The question of whether a copy has the right to exist. Whether something made rather than born deserves the same dignity as something natural. Whether the imperfect version of a thing is still the same thing. Ditto, if the theory is right, never got to have that conversation. It was just released, or it escaped. Or the scientists stopped caring once Mewtwo was finished. And now it wanders, endlessly becoming other things, carrying Mew's ability in a body that can never hold still, in places that remember where it came from. Section 3. The Great Pokémon War. What happened before the games begin? Pokémon Red and Blue, for all their cheerful imagery and bouncy music, take place in a country where something has gone very wrong with the population. Sit with that for a moment. Think about the demographic structure of Kanto, the region those first games are set in. You, the player, are 10 years old. You are allowed, encouraged actually, to leave your home alone and travel the entire country catching wild animals and fighting strangers. Your mother waves goodbye without much apparent concern. Professor Oak, who is in his 60s at least, treats this as completely normal. Your rival, who is roughly your age, sets off at the same time. Where are the fathers? This is not a throwaway question. It is something you can notice systematically if you pay attention. The protagonist of Pokémon Red and Blue has no father in the home. His rival, Blue Oak, has no parents in the home at all. He lives with his grandfather. Nearly every household in the game is run by a woman alone or by older people. The few adult men who do appear in the game fall into very specific categories. They are either old, they are criminals working for Team Rocket, or they are trainers on routes who have professions that keep them away from home sailors, bikers, men described as stationed in cities for work. The young adult men, the generation that would be the fathers of 10-year-olds in the mid to late 1990s, the men in their 30s are essentially absent from Kanto. And then there is Lieutenant Surge. Surge is the gym leader of Vermilion City. He is large, loud, and dressed in military camouflage. He uses electric-type Pokémon, and he has a rank. Before you battle him, he says something that does not quite fit the tone of the rest of the game. He says that his Pokémon saved his life during the war. He calls them the reason he survived. He talks about it the way someone talks about something that really happened, something vivid and specific and still close to the surface even years later. The war. Kanto had a war. Surge does not explain it further, the game does not explain it further, but the word is there, planted in the middle of a gym leader's pre-battle speech, and once you notice it, you cannot unfocus from it. The fan theory built around this detail proposes that the world of Pokémon Red and Blue is set in the aftermath of a devastating conflict, a Pokémon World War, or at least a Kanto-specific catastrophe. The timeline is never specified, but the demographic evidence suggests it was not so long ago close enough that the generation of men who would now be in their 30s and early 40s are the ones who died. close enough that their absence is still shaping the structure of families and communities throughout the region. Lieutenant Surge survived. He has his rank, his trauma, his electric Pokémon who apparently pulled him through something terrible on the front lines. But the others, the protagonist's father, Blue's parents, the fathers of the other young trainers who presumably exist somewhere in the world of the game, did not come back. The absence of fathers is not a narrative oversight. Game Freak could easily have populated Kanto with a more balanced adult population. The absence is a choice. And the choice points towards something that the game cannot say directly because it would shatter the fantasy it is trying to maintain, the fantasy that this is a world where 10-year-olds are safe to roam freely, where adventure is always around the corner, where nothing truly bad can reach you. Except the war already reached this world. It already took the fathers. The evidence is in every empty house, every grandmother raising grandchildren, every mother sending her child out into the world alone, because there is no one left to warn her it might be dangerous. The theory deepens when you consider the role of Professor Oak. He is the most prominent adult male in the early game, and he is old enough to have missed the war by a generation born too early to have fought, perhaps, or old enough to have survived the previous conflict that shaped his own generation. He is a stable figure precisely because he predates whatever happened to the younger men. He gives the protagonists their Pokédex and their first Pokémon not just because it is his job, but because there is no father to do it. He is filling a vacuum that the war created. There is another layer to this, one that involves Lavender Town specifically. Lavender Town in Pokémon Red and Blue is the location of a graveyard for Pokémon, a tower called the Pokémon Tower, where the bones of deceased creatures are laid to rest, and where the townspeople come to mourn. It is one of the most atmospheric locations in the early game, and its music, we will discuss that music extensively in a later section, is designed to unsettle. The town is full of ghost-type Pokémon, and the whole area has a texture of grief that stands out against the rest of the game's energy. If the war theory is correct, then Lavender Town takes on a different meaning. It is not just a place where Pokémon are mourned. It is a place where the weight of loss has accumulated so heavily that it has become atmospheric, has literally shaped the geography of the region. The whole town smells like mourning. The whole town exists inside the gravity of grief. The Pokémon Tower is not just a monument to deceased creatures, it is where a generation of loss has been concentrated, made physical, given a place to live. Team Rocket fits into this theory in an interesting way as well. Giovanni's criminal organization is not small or disorganized. It is a functioning, powerful criminal enterprise that has managed to control significant chunks of Kanto's infrastructure, including the Sylph Company, the most advanced technology manufacturer in the region. How does a crime organization get that powerful? Typically, organized crime expands to fill spaces that normal institutions cannot police. In the aftermath of a war that decimated the adult male population, with law enforcement presumably stretched thin and social institutions struggling to cope with the loss, a powerful criminal organization filling the vacuum makes a certain grim sense. Even Blue's emotional arc, when viewed through the lens of the war theory, becomes richer. Blue is aggressive, dismissive, always one step ahead of you, and always reminding you of it. He pushes forward with an almost frantic energy. He is trying to become the champion, trying to be the most powerful trainer in the world, and he does it without any apparent emotional support structure. His grandfather is there, but professors are busy people, and Blue's parents are nowhere. What drives a kid that hard? Grief, maybe. Emptiness that looks like arrogance from the outside. A need to matter, to achieve something, to become undeniable in a world that took his parents from him. The theory will never be confirmed. Game Freak would not confirm something this dark in a franchise aimed primarily at children and families. But Lieutenant Surge confirmed the war himself, in his pre-battle dialogue, in 1996. The rest is just paying attention. Section 4, Ash Ketchum and the Eternal Journey. The Ho-Oh Wish and the Coma Theory. Ash Ketchum is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since the 1st of April, 1997, when the first episode of the Pokémon anime aired in Japan. As of when these words were written, that is closing in on 3 decades of 10-year-old existence, an accumulation of adventures, friendships, defeats, and eventual triumph that would span dozens of lifetimes by any realistic accounting. The anime never explains this. It never acknowledges it. Ash simply does not age. The seasons change around him, the regions change, his hair stays the same, his voice stays in the same approximate register, and he wakes up every morning looking exactly like he did the day he left Pallet Town with Pikachu at his side. Two major theories have grown up around this strange fact, and they are worth exploring not just as theories but as emotional narratives in their own right, because both of them, in very different ways, say something true about how we relate to stories that we love enough to live inside for years. The first theory is gentler. It starts in the first episode of the anime, in a scene that most fans remember even if they have not thought about it carefully since childhood. Ash and Pikachu are out in the rain, sheltering under some kind of overhang, and above them, brilliant, enormous, trailing a rainbow that appears even in the stormflies, Ho-Oh, a golden bird with feathers like living fire, gone almost before Ash can process what he has seen. At the time of that episode, Ho-Oh did not yet officially exist in the games. It would not be officially revealed until the second generation of games, Pokémon Gold and Silver, years later. But there it was, in the sky above Ash Ketchum, on his very first day as a Pokémon trainer. Ho-Oh's mythology, established fully in the Gold and Silver games, holds that Ho-Oh grants eternal happiness to those lucky enough to see it. Some translations are more specific. Eternal happiness in the journey, not in the destination, in the traveling itself. The theory is simple and beautiful. When Ash saw Ho-Oh in the rain on his first day, Ho-Oh granted him his wish. Maybe it was spoken aloud, or maybe it was the kind of wish that forms in the heart of a child and does not need words, the wish that this could last forever, that the journey could never end, that he would never have to stop being the person who sets out every morning for somewhere new, with Pikachu on his shoulder and the whole world ahead of him. Ho-Oh heard it, or felt it, or simply knew, the way mythological birds and stories always know, and it gave Ash exactly what he wanted. He is 10 years old forever. He is always at the beginning. The journey never ends because he wished it would not, and Ho-Oh obliged. There is real emotional weight to this reading. It is not dark. It is actually quite moving, if you sit with it a child's deepest wish, granted so completely that it becomes the organizing principle of his entire existence. Ash is not aging because somewhere in his 10-year-old heart, he understood that growing up meant leaving this behind, and he did not want to leave. The second theory is darker. This one starts in the same first episode, but it focuses on a different moment, the lightning strike. Pikachu, overwhelmed with emotion during an encounter with a flock of enraged Spearow, releases a massive thunderbolt into the sky. Ash is close. Very close. The blast is enormous. He is, by any reasonable physical assessment, struck by lightning. The anime moves on fairly quickly, and Ash wakes up unharmed and continues his journey. But the theory asks, did he actually wake up? What if the lightning strike put Ash into a coma? What if the hospital he woke up in, the journey he has been on ever since, the tournaments and the Pokémon and the rivals and the legendary encounters, all of it is happening inside the mind of a boy lying in a hospital bed in Pallet Town, watched over by his mother and the soft hum of medical equipment? This theory, which originated as a creepypasta and spread through the fan community in the early 2010s, gains its traction from several things that are genuinely hard to explain otherwise. The first is Team Rocket. Think about how Team Rocket functions in the anime. They are nominally villains. They have a boss, an organization, a stated goal of capturing Pikachu, and yet in practice, they fail every single time. And then they come back the next episode with a new scheme, no apparent consequences for the previous failure, no strategic adaptation. They are not realistic villains. They are recurring characters in a dream, the kind of adversary a child's sleeping mind would produce, familiar and threatening but never actually able to win, always returning in a slightly different costume, always performing the same ritual of defeat and return. The theory argues that Team Rocket's bizarre consistency is a feature of Ash's subconscious, not a flaw in the narrative. The second is the identical Nurse Joys and Officer Jennies. Every Pokémon Center in every region has a Nurse Joy at the counter. Every town with a police presence has an Officer Jenny. They are, apparently, all different people, different members of families with strong genetic resemblances, but the explanation is thin enough that it has always bothered attentive viewers. In a dream, in the mental landscape of a comatose child, this makes complete sense. A figure who represents healing appears at every place of healing, wearing the same face, because that is how the dreaming mind works. It does not generate new faces every time it needs a nurse joy. It repeats. The third is Ash's friends. Each time Ash moves to a new region, he leaves his old companions behind and finds new ones. Misty stays in Cerulean City. Brock leaves. May, Dawn, Iris, Serena, they all have their arcs and they all move on. If the show were simply a children's cartoon, this would just be a franchise decision, a way of keeping things fresh for new viewers. But in the Coma framework, it reads as something else. The dreaming mind protecting itself from grief. If Ash's subconscious knows that certain friendships belong to certain chapters of his life, it creates and then releases those friends, allowing the journey to continue without the weight of permanent loss accumulating into something the dreamer cannot carry. The theory even has a proposed ending. One version suggests that the Sun and Moon series, in which Ash finally wins a regional championship for the first time in decades of the show, represents a moment of healing. That Ash winning finally after all those years and all those near misses is the moment his subconscious decides he is ready to wake up. The journey his dreaming mind constructed was designed to help him work through something: loss, fear, the desire to be extraordinary, and when he achieves it, even in the dream, he edges toward the surface. Is the Coma theory true? No. Pokémon was not written with this in mind. The anime does not age Ash because that is a deliberate commercial decision, not a hidden narrative. And Team Rocket are formulaic because children's television was formulaic in the late 90s, not because Ash's subconscious dreamed them that way. But the theory is compelling not because of its factual accuracy, but because of what it reveals about the emotional reality of the show. Ash does not change because he cannot. He does not grow because the franchise needs him to stay accessible to the next generation of 6-year-olds who will discover this world for the first time. The Coma theory is not a factual account of what happened. It is an emotional metaphor for something that is true. The franchise keeps Ash frozen because it is afraid of what growing up would cost. And in that way, maybe we are all a little bit Ash, the dreaming 10-year-old who never quite made it to 11. Section 5. The weight of a rival's grief. What happened to Raticate? In Pokémon Red and Blue, you fight your rival on the SS Anne. This is a luxury ocean liner docked in Vermilion City, and your rival appears there as he always does, cocky, dismissive, 1 step ahead of you in levels and 2 steps ahead of you in attitude. His team at this point in the game includes a Pidgeotto, a Kadabra, and a Raticate. Raticate is the final evolution of Rattata, the small, purple rat Pokémon that is one of the first wild creatures you encounter in the game. Raticate is faster, bigger, stronger, not a powerhouse, but a solid middle-game Pokémon, the kind of thing a rival would carry in the early chapters of their journey. You beat him, as you always do. The ship moves on. The story continues. The next time you see your rival is in Lavender Town, in the Pokémon Tower, the graveyard, and his Raticate is gone. It is not in his party anymore. It never appears in his team again, not once in any subsequent battle through the rest of the game. His lineup shifts, he gets stronger Pokémon, more evolved, more powerful, and Raticate simply disappears from the record. This is the kind of thing that game developers do all the time for balance reasons, rotating enemy team compositions to reflect the progression of the story. Most of the time it means nothing, but the circumstances here, the specific location, the specific Pokémon, the specific conversation, add up to something that has haunted fans for as long as the games have existed. Your rival, standing in a graveyard, asks you why you are there if none of your Pokémon are dead. It is a strange thing to say. It is, in the context of most children's game dialogue, an unusually pointed observation. Why would he ask that? Why would his mind go immediately to the question of which Pokémon are dead? Why would he be in the Pokémon Tower at all, if not because he has a reason to be there? The theory suggests that your rival's Raticate did not just disappear from its team roster for balance reasons. It died. In the battle on the SS, and your battle, the one you won, Raticate was hurt badly enough that it could not be saved. The ship was crowded. The Pokémon centers are on the mainland. By the time your rival got Raticate to safety, it was too late. He has come to Lavender Town to say goodbye. When you look at the full arc of your rival's behavior through the lens of that theory, something shifts. He starts as the cocky kid who sneers at you and calls you smell, or whatever customized name you gave him. He is confident to the point of obnoxiousness, always a beat ahead, always dismissive. But after Lavender Town, something in him hardens. He becomes less playful and more driven. He pushes toward the championship with an intensity that has less of the game in it than it did before. He gets there first by the time you reach the Elite Four. He has already beaten them. He is already the champion. He has done it faster than you, and it does not seem to have made him happy. When you beat him in the championship battle, his grandfather scolds him on the spot. He criticizes his grandson's lack of care for his Pokémon, his coldness, his focus on power over relationship. And in that moment, with what the theory has told you already sitting in your chest, the cruelty of that scolding lands differently. Your rival lost a Pokémon because of you. He came to a graveyard and buried his grief and turned it into fuel. He became the kind of trainer who wins at any cost, because winning felt like the only response to loss that made sense. And his grandfather, who does not know any of that, stands in the victory hall and tells him he is doing it wrong. There is no win condition for your rival in this story. Not really. The counter-argument to this theory is reasonable. Raticate was probably just benched. Team compositions change throughout game narratives. The rival probably traded it or stored it in his PC. The Lavender Town visit has a simple enough explanation. He is there to investigate the same ghost-type rumors that brought you there. His Pokémon were probably fine. These are all plausible. They are all possibly true, but they do not explain why the game placed that specific exchange in that specific location. They do not explain why your rival is so pointed about asking which of your Pokémon are dead. The writers knew where they were putting this conversation. They knew what the player would bring to it, what they would assemble from the pieces the game had scattered. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was the kind of unintentional resonance that happens when a creative team builds a world with enough detail that the world starts generating its own meanings. Either way, the story is there. Your rival loved a Pokémon, and your victory cost him that. He took his grief and built it into a championship run, and no one in the story ever acknowledged what it cost him. Section 6, The Shadow and its Source. Gengar is Clefable's ghost. This is one of the most visually obvious theories in the franchise, and also one of the most metaphysically interesting. Look at a picture of Clefable, then look at a picture of Gengar. Hold them side by side in your mind. Clefable is a round, soft-looking pink Pokémon with large, pointed ears, small wing-like nubs on its back, a curled tail, stubby arms, and a perpetual expression of placid contentment. It is fluffy-looking. Its shiny form turns it a golden yellow. Its type in the current games is fairy, though in the first generation it was normal. It is associated with the full moon. It appears on clear nights, dancing in mountain meadows, the kind of creature that the Pokédex suggests you would be very lucky to catch a glimpse of. Gengar is round and purple-gray, with large pointed ears, small spiky protrusions on its back, a curled tail, stubby arms, and a wide grinning mouth. Its classification in the Pokédex is specifically the Shadow Pokémon. Its shiny form turns it a pale green. It is Ghost type and Poison type. It is associated with cold spots and the feeling of unease that comes from nowhere, the sensation that something unseen is watching you from the corner of the room. It is one of the original 151 present in the first games, and it has remained one of the franchise's most recognizable designs for 30 years. The body shapes match almost perfectly. The proportions, the placement of the ears, the nubs on the back, the curled tail, the stout arms, they mirror each other across a divide that in the Pokémon world maps to the divide between life and death, between the seen and unseen, between the creature that stands in the moonlight and the shadow it casts on the ground behind it. Gengar's name in Japanese is Gengar, which is derived from the German word doppelganger, a double, a ghostly duplicate, a shadow twin. This was not an accident. Game Freak named Gengar after the concept of a ghostly double and then designed it to look like Clefable's ghostly double, and if you think those two decisions were unconnected, you are considerably more charitable toward coincidence than this evidence warrants. The theory has several readings, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first reading is the simplest. Gengar was designed as Clefable's shadow, literally. The concept of a shadow Pokémon who exists as the dark mirror of a specific real Pokémon is elegant in a way that fits the early game's love of elemental pairing and thematic opposition. Clefable is the lucky, graceful creature of light associated with the moon, rare, beautiful, associated with happiness. Gengar is the creature that lives in the darkness. Those associations create cold, trickster, the thing that makes you nervous at night when you are not quite sure what you saw in your peripheral vision. The second reading goes deeper. Several fan theories have proposed that Gengar is not just visually modeled on Clefable, but is actually the ghost of a deceased Clefable. Ghost-type Pokémon in the Pokémon universe are consistently described in Pokédex entries as beings formed from the lingering energy of creatures or people who died with powerful emotions still unresolved. They are grief made animate, fear made visible. In this reading, Gengar is what Clefable becomes after death, the gentle, moon-loving creature transformed by the circumstances of dying into something colder, something that reaches out in the dark not to be seen but to frighten. The type relationship between the two Pokémon supports this in an unusual way. Normal-type moves cannot hit Ghost-type Pokémon. Ghost-type moves cannot hit Normal-type Pokémon. This type immunity, in the game's mechanics, means that Gengar and Clefable cannot damage each other with their signature attacks. They are immune to each other. A shadow cannot hurt the thing that casts it. A ghost cannot fully reach the living version of itself. The mechanics encode the metaphysics. Clefable's Pokédex entries mention that it is thought by some to have come from space. Clefairy and Clefable are associated with Mount, Moon, where meteorites land, and there is a theory running underneath the Pokémon universe that the Clefairy evolutionary line is actually extraterrestrial in origin, visitors from some other world who chose to remain on Earth. If you follow that thread, then Gengar is not just Clefable's shadow, it is the shadow left behind when something from beyond the stars lands on this world. It is the darkness that accompanied something luminous, the cost of all that light. There is also the historical significance to consider. Clefairy was almost Pikachu. In the early development of the Pokémon anime, Clefairy was the intended mascot, the creature that would be the protagonist's partner, the face of the franchise, the Pokémon that every child would know. The decision to use Pikachu instead was a marketing calculation, made relatively late in production. Gengar, as Clefable's shadow, is therefore the shadow of the road not taken, the dark twin of the choice that was almost made, haunting the franchise from just outside the spotlight. They placed Gengar in the first games, and they placed Clefable in the first games, and they gave them matching bodies and opposing types and a name derived from the word for ghostly double. Whether or not Game Freak intended the full weight of what the fan community has made of this relationship, the relationship is there, and it is one of the most beautifully constructed pieces of thematic architecture in the first generation. Section 7. What the Pokédex actually says. Dark lore in plain sight. Most discussions of dark Pokémon theories focus on things that need to be inferred or extrapolated, connections between data points, implications drawn from what the game does not say. But there is a category of darkness in the Pokémon franchise that requires no extrapolation at all, because it is simply written into the Pokédex entries that players scroll through and then largely forget. The Pokédex is, ostensibly, a scientific encyclopedia of the Pokémon world. It is the device Professor Oak gives you at the start of your journey, and its purpose is to record information about every species you encounter. In practice, its entries range from delightfully mundane to genuinely disturbing, and the disturbing ones tend to cluster around Ghost-type and Dark-type Pokémon, with a density that starts to feel intentional when you lay them out together. Let us start with Yamask. Yamask is a Ghost-type Pokémon introduced in Pokémon Black and White, a small, shadowy figure that floats through the air carrying a golden mask in front of its body. The mask is the important part. According to the Pokédex entry, each Yamask carries a mask that represents the face it had when it was alive. When Yamask was a person, the entry does not hedge this. It does not say is said to have been, or according to legend. It states directly that these Pokémon were once human, and that the golden mask each one carries is the preserved face from its previous life. And then it says that Yamask sometimes looks at that mask and cries, "Stop and let that sit." There is a ghost-type Pokémon in the mainline games that was once a human being, that can still see what its own face looked like when it was alive, and that weeps when it does. This is not hidden. It is in the in-game text that every player reads when they first catch or encounter Yamask. It is presented without dramatic fanfare, written in the same matter-of-fact Pokédex voice used to describe the sleep habits of Snorlax or the swimming speed of Vaporeon. The entry transforms Yamask from a cute little ghost into something much more quietly devastating. It implies that the Pokémon world has a mechanism by which human consciousness does not simply cease at death, but transitions into a Pokémon form. That there are ghost-type Pokémon wandering through caves and old ruins that used to have names, families, jobs, memories. That somewhere, in whatever afterlife exists in this universe, a person who lived an entire human life became Yamask, and now carries their own face in front of them like a memento mori, and sometimes they look at it and remember. Yamask is not alone in this. The Galarian form of Yamask, introduced in the Sword and Shield games, has an entry that describes a different, but equally disturbing origin. A person who was swallowed by ancient clay and transformed. The lore of ghost-type Pokémon in this universe consistently pushes toward the idea that the boundary between human and Pokémon is not as solid as the franchise's child-friendly exterior would suggest. Now consider Drifloon. Drifloon is a balloon-shaped ghost-type Pokémon. It is purple and cute, with a tuft of white fluff on top and a cheerful little X for a face. The Pearl version Pokédex entry describes Drifloon as a Pokémon that tries to grab the hands of small children to steal them away. And then in a detail that has stayed with fans since the games came out, it notes that the Pokémon is sometimes mistaken for a balloon by a child who grabs its string. The implication? Children who grab Drifloon expecting a toy get dragged away to wherever Drifloon is going, which several entries across different games strongly suggest is the afterlife. Later entries add that Drifloon is filled with the spirits of people and Pokémon who have died. It is a little balloon made of ghosts, and it wanders around looking for children to take with it. And if you hand it to your Pokémon trainer at level 12, it will help you battle other trainers in the Sinnoh region. This is a children's game. The tonal dissonance here is part of what makes these entries so affecting. The Pokédex does not italicize the disturbing parts. It does not treat the information about Drifloon stealing children as any different from information about what a Pokémon eats or how fast it can run. The horror is delivered in the same register as the mundane, which makes it somehow more potent, like overhearing a piece of information that was not meant for you. Hypno adds another layer. Hypno is a drowsiness-inducing psychic-type Pokémon, a bipedal, sleepy-looking creature with a pendulum it swings to hypnotize opponents. Its Pokédex entry in Fire Red says that it carries a pendulum-like device, and that if you come across one in the wild, you should never make eye contact. The Soul Silver entry for Hypno notes that there are apparently cases of Hypno taking away children while they slept. Again, presented flatly, matter-of-factly, just a thing that Hypno does. The creepypasta community built an entire poem and associated horror game around Hypno's lullaby, a fictional horror narrative in which a Hypno lures children from their homes with a soothing song and consumes their dreams. The poem spread virally in the early 2010s and became one of the most well-known pieces of Pokémon horror fan content. But it did not have to invent the horror from nothing. It started with what the Pokédex already said and asked what the logical extension of that was. Parasect is perhaps the most genuinely disturbing entry of all, because its horror is biological rather than supernatural. Paras is a small crab-like Pokémon with mushroom growths on its back. As it grows and eventually evolves into Parasect, those mushrooms grow and spread until they completely cover the host creature's body. The eyes of Parasect are blank white, staring at nothing, and the Pokédex explains why. The mushroom, called a Tochukaso, has fully consumed the host. Parasect's body is still moving, still functioning, still eating and battling, but the creature that was originally Paras is gone. What you are looking at is a Pokémon-shaped mushroom walking around in a dead crab's body. This is not fan speculation. This is directly stated in the game's own text. Parasect is a parasitic fungal infection that has fully replaced the consciousness of its host with its own, and you can catch it and keep it in a Pokeball and name it, and it will never know what it is, because what it was is already dead. Pokédex entries like these, and there are dozens more, ranging from the merely eerie to the genuinely unsettling, suggest that Game Freak has always understood that the world of Pokémon contains real darkness. They do not need fan theories to make it dark. They put it in the text. but they put it in the text quietly, in a font size that does not demand attention, in a database entry that most children scroll past in 3 seconds on their way to the next catch. The darkness is there for the ones who are looking, the ones who are willing to slow down and read what the world is actually telling them. Section 8. Lavender Town Syndrome. The song that became a legend. There is no place in the Pokémon games quite like Lavender Town. It is a small, quiet location in the eastern part of Kanto, notable primarily for the Pokémon Tower, a 7-floor graveyard where trainers come to lay deceased Pokémon to rest, and where ghost-type Pokémon drift through the corridors in a permanent state of restless emotion. The town itself has few amenities. There is no gym here, no grand store, no flashy infrastructure, just the tower, a few small buildings, and a very specific piece of music that plays the moment you walk in. The Lavender Town theme is a masterpiece of atmospheric sound design for an 8-bit system. It is composed by Junichi Masuda, who would go on to become one of the most important figures in the entire Pokémon franchise. The track uses dissonant intervals, minor tonality, and a rhythm that does not quite resolve. It keeps turning back on itself, looping in a way that creates a persistent sense of unease without ever releasing into something that feels comfortable. It is soft, but it is wrong. It sounds like the thing that plays in the back of your mind when you are in a place where something sad happened a long time ago. For many players who grew up with the original Game Boy games, the Lavender Town theme is one of the most indelible sonic memories they have. It is the moment the game decided to show you that not everything in its world is cheerful. And then sometime in the early 2010s, a story began to circulate online about what that music was supposedly doing to people. The Lavender Town Syndrome creepypasta, also known as the Lavender Town Tone or the Lavender Town Suicides, is a piece of internet horror fiction that claims to describe real events. According to the story, when Pokémon Red and Green were first released in Japan in February 1996, a spike in unusual events occurred among children between the ages of 7 and 12. Headaches, nausea, behavioral changes. In the most extreme version of the story, suicides. The cause, according to the creepypasta, was the original version of the Lavender Town theme, which supposedly contained high-frequency tones that only children's ears could detect, tones that caused neurological and psychological harm. The story goes on to describe how Nintendo discovered the problem and quietly patched the music in subsequent game versions, lowering or removing the dangerous frequencies. This would explain, the narrative suggests, why the Japanese first print versions of Red and Green reportedly have a slightly different and more extreme version of the music than the versions most Western players encountered. The creepypasta is not true. This needs to be stated clearly. There is no evidence that the Lavender Town theme caused any deaths or illnesses. There is no documented spike in child suicides in Japan following the game's release. There is no credible scientific mechanism by which chiptune audio from a Game Boy cartridge could cause the kind of damage the story describes. The original version of the music that gets shared in connection with this theory is typically just the Japanese version of the track, which does sound somewhat different from the international version, but not in the dramatic ways the legend suggests. The whole apparatus of the creepypasta, from the specific numbers to the claimed government documentation to the idea of sinister frequencies embedded in children's software, is pure fiction. But it is fiction that worked. The Lavender Town Syndrome spread through forums and comment sections and YouTube videos with remarkable efficiency. And the reason it worked is inseparable from the reason the actual music works. The Lavender Town theme is genuinely unsettling. The town itself is genuinely strange. The franchise had, by the time the creepypasta emerged, already established that some of its Pokédex entries described genuinely dark things. Parasect exists. Yamask exists. The war theory exists. The ground was already prepared for something sinister to take root in Lavender Town, because Lavender Town was already where the franchise had buried its heaviest feelings. The creepypasta asked, what if it went further? What if the music that makes you feel strange was actually designed to make you feel strange, and the design was malicious? What if Nintendo knew and covered it up? What if the feeling of unease that every player experiences when they first walk into Lavender Town was a warning that no one heeded? None of it is true, but all of it is emotionally coherent with the world the games built. That is why it lasted. That is why it became the most famous piece of Pokémon urban legend ever constructed, the benchmark against which all other gaming creepypastas are measured. There is an irony in all of this, which is that the actual 1,997 Pokemon anime did produce a genuine documented case of children being harmed by flashing lights in an episode. That was the Porygon incident, the 38th episode of the original anime, which used rapidly strobing red and blue lights in an action sequence, triggering photosensitive epileptic responses in hundreds of children watching the broadcast. That was real. That was documented. That led to permanent changes in how the anime was produced, and it effectively ended Porygon's anime career despite Pikachu being the one who actually caused the flashing attack. The real harm was documented and then mostly forgotten. The fictional harm, the Lavender Town Syndrome, became legend. The music endures. It will always be associated with something heavy, something unresolved, something that does not let go. That is not the result of sinister embedded frequencies. That is the result of a composer who understood, in 1996, that a graveyard deserved music that felt like grief, and who wrote that feeling into a 12-second loop that plays forever. Section 9. The God Before Everything, Arceus, Unown, and the Shape of the Universe. The mythology of the Pokemon universe has always existed in fragments, scattered across games and regions and Pokédex entries, and for the first several generations, most players experienced it as exactly that, fragments. Interesting details about individual Pokémon, hints of history in certain locations, references to legendary creatures that the games treated with appropriate reverence. It was not until Pokémon Diamond and Pearl and the revelations of the Sinnoh mythology that the cosmology of the Pokémon world was finally expressed in something approaching a coherent whole. And at the center of that cosmology is Arceus. Arceus is, according to Sinnoh legend, the original one, a Pokémon that emerged from an egg in a void of absolute nothing before the universe existed and then proceeded to create everything. The Pokédex entry states that Arceus shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms. This is the Pokémon equivalent of the first verse of Genesis, the Pokémon equivalent of the Vedic creation hymns, the Pokémon equivalent of Arceus created Dialga, who controls time. It created Palkia, who controls space. It created Giratina, who controls antimatter and rules over the distortion world, the dark mirror of reality, the place where the laws of physics do not apply, the inverse universe that exists alongside our own. It created Uxie, who gave knowledge to the living things of the world. It created Mesprit, who gave emotion. It created Azelf, who gave willpower. These three, knowledge, emotion, willpower, are the components that together allow conscious experience. Without all three, mind does not exist. Arceus seems to have understood this when building the world, and built minds by distributing those components across three separate beings who guard three separate lakes. This is extraordinary world building for a franchise that started as a game about children catching creatures. The Sinnoh mythology is legitimately sophisticated theological construction, drawing from multiple real-world religious and philosophical traditions and synthesizing them into a coherent, fictional cosmology. The fan theory layer comes from the question of the 1,000 arms. Arceus, as a physical Pokémon, does not have 1,000 arms. It has 4 legs and a body that resembles a white horse with a golden wheel around its midsection. Where are the arms? What does it mean to say it shaped the universe with 1,000 arms when the physical creature clearly does not have them? The theory points to the Unown. Unown are a family of flat, eye-shaped Pokémon, each one corresponding to a letter of the alphabet plus 2 punctuation marks. 28 forms in total, each one a single letter or symbol with a single eye floating in its center. Individually, they are among the weakest Pokémon in the game. Terrible stats, only 1 available move. No evolutionary line, no competitive viability. Alone, they are nothing. But when gathered in large numbers, something changes. The third Pokémon movie, Spell of the Unown, depicts what happens when hundreds of Unown act in concert. They create matter from thought. In the film, a child's wishes, channeled through a mass of Unown, produce an entire crystal palace, a fully realized environment built from a dream. The Unown do not just float in that sequence, they become the substrate of reality itself, the alphabet through which the universe writes new things into existence. The theory proposes that the Unown are Arceus's arms, that when the Pokédex describes Arceus shaping the universe with 1,000 arms, it is describing the Unown, the 28 symbols of creation, each one a tool, each one a letter in the language the universe is written in. Arceus's body is singular, physical, an anchored point. Its arms are the unown, distributed, symbolic, capable of creating anything when enough of them act together. There is supporting evidence in the games themselves. At the Sinjo Ruins, an ancient site connecting the Johto and Sinnoh regions, accessible through a special event in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the player encounters Arceus, surrounded by unown. Massive numbers of them, filling the air, churning around the original one like attendants around a throne. In this event, Arceus produces an egg of one of the creation trio Dialga, Palkia, or Giratina, which the player can receive. The unown are present specifically in this act of creation. They are there when Arceus makes something, not as spectators but as tools, as the mechanism through which the god's intention becomes physical reality. The same logic applies to the ruins of Alph and Johto, which is filled with unown and which contains ancient writing in their shapes. The same applies to the Tenobi ruins in Fire Red and Leaf Green, to the Solacean ruins in Diamond and Pearl. Wherever ancient civilization left records, wherever the oldest marks of existence persist in the world, unown are present. They are the original alphabet. They predate human language because they are not just symbols of language, they are the mechanism through which the universe itself was named into being. Arceus's creation mythology, seen through this lens, becomes something genuinely breathtaking in its scope. The original one did not just will the universe into existence, it used 28 symbols, 28 arms, 28 fundamental creative tools that function as both language and physics simultaneously. And those tools still wander the world in their diminished forms, individually weak, easy to overlook, but carrying inside each letter-shaped body the memory of a time when they were the instruments of a god, building everything from nothing. This theory also has implications for what the ancient ruins of the Pokémon world represent. If unown are Arceus's creative alphabet, then structures built near unown are structures built in proximity to the universe's original language. The ruins of Alph, the Solacean ruins. These are not just archaeological curiosities. They are places where the membrane between the everyday world and the substrate of creation is thinner than elsewhere. Places where, if you could only read what the walls are saying, you would find instructions for things that should not be possible. The franchise has never fully committed to this theory in official materials, but it has never fully contradicted it either. The presence of unown at every major act of Arceusian creation, from the Sinjo Ruins event to the movie, is too consistent to be accidental. Game Freak built a creation mythology, and they built it with symbols for letters, and they put it in the background of every ancient ruin in the world. And they left us to figure out what we were looking at. Section 10N is a Zoroark, the identity hidden in a letter. Pokémon Black and White, released in Japan in 2010, is widely considered one of the most narratively ambitious games in the franchise's history. It introduced a villain with a genuine philosophy, not just, I want power or I want to rule the world, but a coherent argument about the ethics of keeping Pokémon as companions and battle partners. It asked players to consider whether the entire premise of the franchise catching, training, battling was something they had any right to do. The character who makes that argument is N. N is one of the most unusual characters in the franchise. His full name, Natural Harmonia Gropius, is the kind of name that only exists in fiction written by people with a great deal of faith and symbolism. He is the king of Team Plasma, the villain organization of Unova. He has grown up largely isolated from human society, raised among Pokémon, and as a result, he can hear the thoughts and feelings of Pokémon directly, not as vague impressions, but as actual communication. He talks to Pokémon the way other characters talk to people. His argument is that human trainers treat Pokémon as tools, and that this is cruel, and that the only ethical response to the situation is to separate humans and Pokémon entirely, to free every Pokémon from every Pokéball, and allow them to return to a natural state. He is manipulated by Getsis, his foster father, who does not actually believe any of this and is using N as a front for his own power grab. But N himself believes it completely. He is not cynical. He is sincere, and his sincerity is the most interesting thing about him. The theory about N's identity begins with a question. What is he? Getsis, the true villain of the game, says several things about N that most players initially interpret as metaphorical insults. He calls N a freak without a human heart. He says N was never a real human. He speaks about N's ability to communicate with Pokémon as something inherent, something structural, not a skill developed through patience, but a capacity that is simply part of what N is. These are alarming things to say about your supposed son. They are alarming enough that the fan community started asking, what if Getsis is being literal? Zoroark is a dark-type Pokémon introduced alongside Black and White. Its ability, Illusion, allows it to disguise itself as another Pokémon entirely, copying their appearance and name to fool opponents until it takes damage and the illusion breaks. In the anime and supporting promotional material, Zoroark's illusionary capabilities are depicted as extensive. It can create full-scale visual transformations, fool multiple people simultaneously, and in some depictions mimic human speech. The evidence for N being a Zoroark is distributed across both Black and White and their sequels. In Black and White, at the climactic approach to N's castle, the player follows a Zoroark through the grounds. The Zoroark runs ahead, the player gives chase. The Zoroark enters a room. The player enters the same room and finds N standing there. No Zoroark is present. The Pokeball that would contain it is nowhere visible. N had released all his Pokémon before this encounter. According to the story, the only one he kept was the version's legendary Reshiram or Zekrom. He does not have a Pokeball for a Zoroark, but a Zoroark entered that room, and N was inside it. In Black 2 and White 2, the sequel set 2 years later, the player visits the ruins of N's castle. Before they find N inside, they encounter a Zoroark who guides them to the location. The Zoroark vanishes once N appears. At one point in Black and White, a memory sequence is triggered, a flashback showing N as a child, watching Team Plasma grunts. The unusual detail is that this memory sequence is not triggered by talking to N. It is triggered by interacting with a Zoroark. In every other memory sequence in the game, the player interacts with the person whose memory it is. This memory is accessed through the Zoroark, as if the Zoroark holds the memory because the Zoroark is the person. There is one more detail. Turn the letter N 90 degrees clockwise. In several East Asian writing contexts, rotated letters carry significance. When you rotate N by 180 degrees, it becomes Z. N becomes Z. The name of a Pokémon who is, in the game, always appearing and disappearing in proximity to a character whose name is a single letter, a letter that becomes Z when you turn it around. What would it mean if N is a Zoroark? It would mean that Getsis found a Zoroark, possibly a very young Zorua, and raised it in deliberate isolation, surrounded by Pokémon and cut off from human development, specifically to cultivate its illusionary ability into something that could convincingly maintain a human form. It would explain why N communicates with Pokémon so effortlessly, not because he is a sensitive human, but because he is a Pokémon himself, listening to others of his kind. It would explain Getsis's contempt, the references to N's non-human heart, the constant implication that N is being used. Getsis was not raising a son. He was training a tool, a Zoroark who believes it is a human boy who believes in liberating Pokémon from trainers, deployed as a figurehead for an organization whose real goal is world domination. The cruelty of this reading is profound. N, the character in the game with the most genuine ethical feeling, the one who actually cares about Pokémon, would himself be a Pokémon who does not know what he is. Used by a human who believes Pokémon should serve human ambitions. The deepest irony in a game built on dramatic irony. The theory has never been confirmed. The game designer's intention was almost certainly that N is a human being with unusual empathy. But the evidence woven into the game's construction creates a genuine ambiguity, the kind that good fiction sometimes produces accidentally, or semi-accidentally, or through a combination of careful design and the simple fact that the more detail you put into a world, the more patterns emerge that the original design did not intend but cannot quite escape. Section 11. The inside of a Pokeball. Consciousness, consent, and the ethics of capture. We have been treating the mechanics of Pokeballs as a given for this entire conversation. Pokemon go in. Pokemon come out. The ball shrinks for easy carrying. It glows when you have a Pokemon inside. This is just how the world works. But when you start asking what it is actually like to be inside a Pokeball, what happens to the Pokemon's consciousness, what it experiences, whether it has any agency over the process, the comfortable mechanics of the franchise start to bend under examination, and the world they describe becomes something considerably more complicated. Let us start with what the franchise itself has established, because it is more than most people remember. In the anime, there are Pokémon who refuse to enter their Pokéballs. Ash's Pikachu is the most famous example from the very beginning of the series. Pikachu refuses to stay in the ball, and Ash eventually stops trying, allowing Pikachu to travel outside. This refusal is played as a personality quirk and ultimately a mark of the trust between Ash and Pikachu, but the fact that it is even possible is notable. Pokeballs are not absolute. Pokemon inside them are not fully incapacitated. There is some form of awareness inside the ball, some subjective experience, that allows Pikachu to have preferences about whether it wants to be in there. Team Rocket's Meowth similarly refuses Pokeball storage throughout the series. Jesse and James occasionally call him back to his ball, but Meowth resists, and this resistance is honored. The ball does not override the Pokemon's will. This is a technological device that can contain living beings, but those living beings retain some form of consciousness and some form of agency even while contained. The anime has given us at least one depiction of the interior of a Pokeball. In an episode involving Misty's Psyduck, a brief visualization suggests a comfortable, rounded white space, peaceful, simple, essentially a rest state. Official materials have reinforced this idea. The inside of a Pokeball is designed to be comfortable for its inhabitant, converting the Pokemon into a form of energy for easy transport and storage while maintaining their well-being. The theory that emerges from this, and it is not a single theory but a cluster of related questions, is about consent and agency. If Pokemon are conscious, and they clearly are, they have feelings, personalities, preferences, the ability to communicate, and in some cases, Meowth, Metagross, various psychic types, human-level or near-human-level cognition. Then the act of capturing a wild Pokemon raises questions that the games and anime both carefully avoid confronting directly. A wild Pokemon in the tall grass has not volunteered to join your team. You throw a ball at it while it is weakened from battle, and if the ball closes and the capturing animation plays, you now own it. It will be deployed in your name, fight in your name, potentially suffer in your name. The franchise has developed a counter-narrative to this discomfort over the decades. The anime consistently shows Pokemon who love their trainers, who choose to fight for them, who stay even when given opportunities to leave. Ash's Bulbasaur chooses to remain with Ash over returning to a Pokemon preserve. Charizard, despite years of disobedience, eventually develops genuine respect and loyalty. The games from Black and White onward have increasingly engaged with the ethical dimension of the Pokemon-trainer relationship, with N's philosophy serving as the clearest articulation of the uncomfortable question the franchise has always carried. Is this world as harmonious as it presents itself? But the darker reading persists alongside the official one. Consider that a Pokemon captured in a Pokeball goes wherever the trainer goes. It has no choice in destination. It is deployed in battles it did not choose to enter. It can be traded away to strangers. It can be stored indefinitely in a PC box, a digital storage system in the games where Pokemon can remain for months or years of in-game time, essentially in a state of suspended animation, while the trainer goes about their business with other Pokemon. There are players who have, over the course of their playthroughs, caught hundreds of Pokemon and stored the vast majority of them permanently in digital boxes, never to be used or acknowledged again. The theory version of this is perhaps most pointedly expressed through the question of what it feels like, subjectively, to be a Pokemon in a PC box. The game treats it as irrelevant. The Pokemon are just in storage, technically, but they are conscious beings. They have personalities and preferences. They experience time. If the inside of an active Pokeball is a comfortable rest state, is the inside of a PC box the same? Or is it something else, a longer, darker stillness? A waiting that goes on and on without a context, without a reason, without the trainer ever coming back. The franchise has brushed against this question. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, the move storage was removed from the game, reportedly because it led to Pokemon being permanently deleted rather than just stored, a distinction that implies the designers thought about what happens to the Pokemon's existence in those conditions. In Pokemon Black and White, an NPC in the storage system building delivers a quietly devastating monologue about how strange it is to think about where Pokemon are when they are in boxes and what they might be experiencing. The most affecting version of this theory does not argue that the Pokémon world is secretly cruel. It argues something more nuanced, that the Pokémon world contains genuine ethical complexity that most of its inhabitants, including the player, choose not to examine. That Pokéballs are wonderful technology and that most Pokémon are probably fine, but that the few who are not the captured creatures who miss their homes, the stored Pokémon waiting in digital boxes for years, the ones who never wanted to be caught, are a category the world has created and then found it easier not to think about too carefully. N was right about the question, even if his answer total separation of humans and Pokémon was wrong. The question is real. The ethics are real. And they were present in the franchise from the first moment a 10-year-old threw a ball at a Pidgey in the tall grass and did not wonder whether the Pidgey wanted to come along. Section 12. Why the Theories Never Die. Closing Reflections. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. The secret origins of Ditto in a burnt-out laboratory on Cinnabar Island. The war that emptied Kanto of its fathers. Ash's 10-year-old eternity, granted by a golden bird in a rainstorm. The grief of a rival who came to a graveyard because you killed his Pokémon on a ship. The shadow that moves like a ghost of something that used to be alive. The darkness encoded in Pokédex entries written with the same casual tone used to describe tail lengths and dietary preferences. The creepypasta that became legend because the real music was already half-haunted. The God before the universe. Writing creation with the fingers of an alphabet. A young man who may be a Pokémon who does not know he is a Pokémon, advocating for the rights of beings who are exactly what he is. The question at the center of everything about what it means to capture a conscious creature and carry it in a ball on your belt. These theories span 30 years of fan engagement with a franchise that has never fully decided whether it wants to be a children's game about friendship and adventure, or something older and stranger and more honest about the world. The answer, of course, is that it wants to be both. And it mostly manages to be both, and the tension between those two ambitions is exactly what creates the space where theories live. Fan theories exist where official canon is silent. They move into the gaps, the unanswered questions, the narrative choices that seem too specific to be accidental, the demographic absences, the visual coincidences that stack up until they look like design. They are, at their best, a form of collaborative storytelling between creators and audience, where the audience takes what the creators made and finishes sentences that the creators left hanging. But they are also something more personal than that. Every theory in this video is, at some level, about what you bring to the franchise. If the theory about the Kanto War moves you, it is because you have felt the absence of fathers as a weight in the world, or because you have read enough history to know that wars leave demographic holes that persist for generations. If the coma theory resonates, it is because you understand the feeling of not wanting something wonderful to end, the unconscious bargain of the mind that would rather dream than wake up to the fact that things change. If the story of the rivals Raticate lands in your chest, it is because you have felt what it is like to lose something and not be able to tell anyone, and to turn that loss into an engine for relentless forward motion. The Pokémon universe is a children's world that keeps growing up. The 10-year-olds who threw those first Pokéballs in 1996 or 1999 or 2002 or 2006 are adults now, and they brought their adult sensibilities back to the world that shaped them, and found to their genuine surprise in many cases that the world was richer than they remembered. That the darkness they thought they were projecting onto a simple game was actually there, encoded in the text, in the Pokédex entries, in the demographic structure of the NPCs, in the music that plays when you walk into a town full of ghosts. They were not wrong to go looking. The world rewards attention. Every time a new game comes out, the cycle renews. New regions with new mythologies and new gaps for theories to fill. New Pokémon with unsettling Pokédex entries and ambiguous evolutionary origins. New characters with secrets written into their design for the ones who look. The franchise has been alive long enough that it now has its own mythology about its mythology fan theories that have themselves become part of the cultural landscape, shared across generations of players, passed along the way folklore used to be passed, in schoolyards and comment sections, and long video essays on YouTube channels named after the games they grew up with. That transmission, that handing off of interpretive frameworks and beloved mysteries, is itself a kind of meaning-making that the games never anticipated and cannot fully control. The stories people tell about Pokémon are part of Pokémon now. The theories are part of the canon of how we experience the world. The Raticate is dead, and the Raticate is not dead, and both are true, and neither the game nor anyone else gets to settle it for you. There is something deeply comfortable about that ambiguity, at the hour when you are watching this. In the quiet, in the dark, with the screen in front of you and the rest of the world pulled back to a safe distance, the mysteries of the Pokémon universe sit exactly at the right weight. They are heavy enough to be interesting, but not so heavy that they press. They are old enough to feel settled, familiar, like returning to something you know rather than encountering something new. They have been thought about by millions of people before you, and they will be thought about by millions more after you, and tonight they are yours. The Pokémon world has always been about the journey. Not the destination, not catching them all, not becoming champion, not finally filling the last slot in the Pokédex. The journey, the travel, the walking forward into tall grass without knowing what is in there, with a small creature by your side who chose to be there through a world that is brighter and stranger and more haunted than it first appeared. That is what these theories are too. A journey into a world you thought you knew. A walk into the tall grass of everything the franchise left unsaid, and a willingness to sit with what you find there. If you have made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. This kind of content is made for people who are willing to slow down, and the fact that you stayed is the whole point. If you enjoyed this, if you are still here, maybe a little more relaxed than when you started, maybe drifting, then subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this to come. More theories. More slow walks through fictional worlds with real weight in them. More long nights with good company. Drop a comment if you are still awake. Tell me where in the world you are, what the hour is, whether you are in bed or on a couch or at a desk. The geography of this audience is one of the things that genuinely delights me, that this content reaches people in completely different conditions, different time zones, different relationships to the franchise, different versions of the 10-year-old they used to be. Rest well. The tall grass will be there in the morning. Script every Pokémon theory to fall asleep to. All theories clearly marked as fan speculation where not confirmed by official sources. Lavender Town Syndrome noted as fictional creepypasta, not a documented real-world event. Section 13 Cubone, Kangaskhan, and the theory written in bones. There is a Pokémon in the original games that most players know purely as sad. Cubone is a small bipedal creature that wears a skull on its head and carries a bone as a weapon. Its Pokédex entry, from the very first games, describes it as the lonely Pokémon. It wears the skull of its dead mother. It cries at night because it misses her. When it cries, the skull rattles, and the hollow sound reverberates in the dark. It has been grieving for its entire life, carrying the most literal possible reminder of loss on its face, looking out at the world through the eye sockets of someone it loved. This is a Pokémon designed for a children's game. It was placed in a graveyard. The Cubone you encounter in the original Pokémon Red and Blue is found almost exclusively in the Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, the same graveyard where a ghost haunts the upper floors and refuses to let anyone pass. In that tower, there is a Mother Marowak, whose spirit has not moved on, because she was killed by Team Rocket while protecting her child. Her ghost is one of the few enemies in the original games that cannot be captured. It exists outside the normal rules. A presence that demands acknowledgement rather than collection. When you defeat her spirit and put her to rest, you free whatever is holding the tower in its weight of grief. The Cubone she was protecting is the one you find in the tower, the one that is now alone. The theory that has grown around Cubone over decades goes deeper than that basic narrative, though. It proposes that Cubone and Kangaskhan are connected in a way that the games never explicitly confirmed, but that the evidence strongly supports. Kangaskhan is a large, bipedal, dinosaur-like Pokémon with a permanently present baby in its pouch. The baby has never had its own separate Pokémon status in the mainline games. It rides in its mother's pouch, participates in the Mega Evolution attack animations, and looks, if you examine the sprites carefully, remarkably similar to Cubone. The Kangaskhan baby has the same round, reptilian head shape, the same proportions. The baby in the pouch and the small, lonely creature with the bone are built from the same visual language. The theory is this. When a Kangaskhan mother dies, the baby she was carrying is left alone. It finds her skull. It puts the skull on its head, both as protection and as an act of mourning, and in doing so, it becomes Cubone. The transformation is not biological in the usual sense. It is an act of grief so profound and so complete that it changes what the creature is. And the skull it wears is not just any skull. It is the exact skull of the exact mother who carried it, the one face in the world it knew longest. Cubone evolves into Marowak, which is larger and more adapted to the lone existence it has been living. Female Marowak, the theory continues, can eventually evolve further into Kangaskhan, completing the cycle. The grieving child becomes, eventually, the mother who will be grieved. The skull it wears is absorbed, incorporated, becomes part of Marowak's skeletal structure, which is why Marowak no longer wears it as a separate object. And then someday, if that Kangaskhan dies while its own baby is watching, the cycle begins again. This would mean that the Pokémon world contains a creature that is perpetually caught in a loop of loss and survival, generation after generation of Cubone wearing their mothers' faces, all of them ultimately destined to become the mothers who will be worn in turn. It is one of the most quietly Greek tragedy-shaped ideas in the entire franchise, a cycle of mourning that carries no resolution, just the continuous transformation of grief into survival and survival into grief. The glitch Pokémon known as M, distinct from the more famous Missing No, adds a remarkable layer to this. M is one of several glitch entities that exist in the code of Pokémon Red and Blue, accessible through various manipulation techniques. When caught and leveled up, M evolves into Kangaskhan, not into Missing No, not into any of the other Pokémon that glitch entities sometimes produce, specifically Kangaskhan. The coding structure of the original games places an evolution trigger in the data for M that points directly to Kangaskhan, which some researchers argue is the remnant of a scrapped fourth stage in an evolutionary line that once went Cubone, Marowak, some intermediate form, now surviving only as glitched data, Kangaskhan. The developers, the theory argues, decided this was too dark. A cycle of death and maternal inheritance, a Pokémon that literally becomes its mother after generations of mourning this, was not something they could put in a game marketed to children without softening it, and they could not soften it without losing what made it meaningful. So they separated the line. Kangaskhan became its own standalone Pokémon. The evolutionary code was removed from the main game but left traces in the underlying data, which is now accessible only through glitches. The cycle was broken in the code, even if its logic persists in the visual design of every Cubone and every Kangaskhan baby that has existed in the games ever since. Pokémon Sun and Moon provided what many fans consider the closest thing to official confirmation this theory will ever receive. In those games, when wild Pokémon are threatened and call for help, they summon Pokémon from their own evolutionary family. Cubone, when it calls for help in Pokémon Sun and Moon, sometimes summons a Kangaskhan, not a Marowak. A Kangaskhan, a Pokémon that shares no evolutionary relationship with Cubone in the official Pokédex, and that should have no reason to answer a Cubone's distress call, unless they share something that the official classification does not capture. Unless the game, in a moment of coded muscle memory from decades of fan theory and suppressed developer intention, remembered what Cubone and Kangaskhan are to each other. It is, as far as anyone knows, a coincidence, or an Easter egg, or an acknowledgement. The developers have never said which. Section 14, the ghost in the code, Missing No, and what it means to exist. Missing No is, depending on who you ask, the most famous glitch in gaming history, a genuine technical anomaly, a deliberate structural placeholder, or a near mythological figure in the folklore of a generation of children who could not explain what they had seen and did not have the internet to help them. Its name is an abbreviation of missing number. It has a sprite several, actually, depending on the version of the game and the specific hexadecimal slot you access it through. Some forms look like scrambled blocks of pixels. Some look like vertical bars of static. The most famous form, the one most associated with the name, resembles a blocky vertical pile of noise, like a television losing signal. It has stats. It has a Pokédex number, 000, or, in some versions, 999. It has a cry. It can be caught. In some versions of the game, catching it or encountering it will duplicate the sixth item in your bag, a glitch so powerful and so useful that generations of players deliberately sought Missing No, out to exploit it for rare item duplication. The fact that Missing No is a glitch is not in dispute. What is in dispute, what has been in productive, creative dispute for 30 years, is what exactly missing no is a glitch of, and what its existence reveals about the underlying architecture of the game. The most technically accurate explanation is that missing no is a set of empty or malformed data entries, leftover placeholder structures from the development process that the game never fully cleaned out. When the game's encounter system looks up a Pokémon for a specific slot in the wild encounter table and finds nothing there, or finds corrupted data, it generates something from whatever it can access, which produces the visual scramble that players see as missing no. It is the game's way of handling a query with no valid answer, not by crashing, but by returning a kind of nonsense that at least does not destroy everything. But one of the more elegant readings of missing no goes further. The Pokédex in the original games has 151 entries, numbered from 001 Bulbasaur through 151 Mew. But the internal indexing of the game has space for 256 slots, a number determined by the way data is stored in memory on the original Game Boy hardware, which uses a single byte to identify each Pokémon, and a single byte can represent numbers from 0 to 255. The gap between 151 actual Pokémon and 255 available slots is filled with something. The game has to put something in those slots, or the encounter system fails when it accidentally references them. So, Game Freak filled the empty slots with placeholder data, structures that exist to keep the game from crashing, but that were never meant to be accessible. Missing no is the face that placeholder data shows when the game's systems accidentally expose it to the player. What this means is that missing no was always in the game. It was not generated by the players cheating or glitching. It was sitting there in the data from day one of the cartridge's existence, waiting in numbered darkness for something to call it up. Every copy of Pokémon Red and Blue contains missing no. The game was shipped with it. It was not an oversight so much as a necessary evil, the structural cost of a specific technical architecture. The theory layer on top of this technical foundation asks, what does it mean that the game contains a space for something that does not exist? That there is a Pokémon-shaped hole in the world, 104 such holes actually, filled with glitch noise that becomes visible when you look at it from the wrong angle? One reading is philosophical. Missing no is proof that every world, no matter how complete it seems, has absences built into its architecture. The 151 Pokémon of the original Kanto were always surrounded by the ghosts of the Pokémon that were never made, the 104 empty slots that the game could not just leave open. Missing no is what nothing looks like when a system needs to acknowledge it. It is the game making visible what was always there, the absence that had to be defined in order for the presence to exist. Another reading is about identity and legitimacy. For many of the children who encountered missing no in the 90s, the experience was genuinely disorienting, not just technically, but ontologically. A Pokémon that was not supposed to be there, a creature that existed in the game but that the game did not recognize. It was in the Pokédex as entry 000 but had no real entry. It had a sprite but the sprite was broken. It had stats but they were the wrong stats. It had a cry but the cry was distorted. It was there, unmistakably, verifiably. Your friend who saw it on his Game Boy last Tuesday said he caught it, but the game refused to properly acknowledge what it was. Missing no raised the question that would eventually become central to an entire branch of fan theory about the franchise. What does it mean to exist in a world that uses numbered slots to define who and what is real? If your number is not in the Pokédex, do you exist? If you exist but the official record does not have space for you, what are you? The glitch has been encountered and recounted so many times that it has acquired the quality of folklore. There are people who, with absolute sincerity, will describe their childhood encounter with missing no as one of the most genuinely strange experiences they have ever had, the feeling of touching something the game was not supposed to show, of seeing what was underneath the carefully painted surface of a world they thought they knew completely. It is the earliest example most of those players had of the concept that the surfaces of things are not the same as their depths. That what you are shown and what is true are not always identical. For a children's game, that is a remarkably mature thing to accidentally teach. Section 15, The Professor and the Poacher. What the adults of Kanto are actually doing. Let us return to the world of the first games and sit for a moment with some of the adult characters, because once you start looking at them through a certain lens, the picture they collectively form is strange and slightly uncomfortable in ways that younger players typically do not notice. Professor Oak is the most prominent and respected scientist in Kanto. He has devoted his life to the study of Pokémon, specifically to the question of the relationship between Pokémon and people. He gives the protagonist their first Pokémon and their Pokédex. He is warm, encouraging, reliable. When you beat the game, he is there to acknowledge your accomplishment. He is, functionally, the benevolent mentor figure, the wise old man at the beginning of the hero's journey who sets everything in motion. He also asks a 10-year-old to go document the entire natural world for him. This is worth examining. The Pokédex is framed as a scientific tool, and completing it is framed as a noble academic goal. Professor Oak wants to understand Pokémon, wants to know how many there are, wants data, but the protagonist is not a scientist. The protagonist is a child who just got out of bed. Professor Oak is, functionally, outsourcing his research to a minor, sending a 10-year-old into potentially dangerous wilderness to collect data that Oak himself is too old and too sedentary to collect. The gym challenge, the Pokémon League, the whole competitive structure of the game, all of it exists in a context where it was set in motion by a professor who needed a data collector and had a 10-year-old conveniently nearby. This is not a dark theory so much as a quietly funny reframing. Professor Oak is a brilliant scientist who has realized that the most efficient way to gather comprehensive field data is to make it into a game that children want to play. The Pokédex is gamified data collection, and the children of Kanto have been doing Oak's research for free for decades. The theory about the gym leaders takes a different shape. The gym system in Kanto is ostensibly a meritocratic hierarchy, a way of testing trainers and certifying that they have achieved a certain level of skill. But when you look at the individual gym leaders, several of them have reasons beyond pure dedication to the training arts to be holding the positions they hold. LT, Surge, as we have already discussed, is a military veteran who survived a war using his Pokémon. His position as Vermilion City gym leader might be understood as a kind of post-war placement, a way of giving a soldier who fought for the region a position of honor and authority that keeps him connected to a community he protected. His gym is in a port city, one of the first cities accessible from the ocean, which has military strategic significance in a way that inland locations do not. Sabrina, the psychic-type gym leader of Saffron City, is described in her backstory as having developed psychic powers at a young age, powers so strong that they began to consume her personality and distance her from normal human connection. Her gym is in the largest and most technologically advanced city in Kanto, which also happens to be the city where Sylph Company, the dominant corporation of the region, is headquartered. The combination of powerful psychic abilities and proximity to the region's corporate and technological center creates an interesting question about power dynamics in Kanto that the game never directly addresses. Giovanni, of course, is both the leader of Team Rocket and the gym leader of Viridian City. This is not a theory, it is canonical. The villain of the game is also, officially, the 8th and final gym leader. He runs a criminal organization that has infiltrated the Kanto power structure to the extent that one of the official sanctioned positions in the region's government-adjacent certification system is occupied by its leader. This means the Pokémon League, which is presumably a legitimate institution, either has no idea that its Viridian gym leader is also a crime boss, or it does know and has decided that this is acceptable, or it is itself compromised in ways the game does not explore. None of these are standard children's game storytelling. They are the texture of a world in which power structures are not clean, in which the institutions that present themselves as meritocratic may have other dynamics running underneath them, in which the adults who are supposed to be trustworthy authorities have complicated, sometimes compromised positions. The game does not lecture you about any of this. It just builds the world and lets it sit there, and the players who are old enough to notice what they are looking at find themselves with a very different picture of Kanto than the one they had at age 10. Section 16, The Butterfly and the Moth, Evolutionary Lines That Never Should Have Mixed. There is a theory about Pokémon evolution that has been circulating since the early days of the franchise, and it concerns 4 Pokémon from the original 151 that have a structural relationship problem. The theory is sometimes called the Caterpie Venonat swap, and it is the kind of thing that, once pointed out, becomes very hard to unsee. Caterpie is a green caterpillar that evolves into Metapod, a green cocoon, which evolves into Butterfree, a large butterfly-like Pokémon with blue and white wing patterns and large red eyes. Venonat is a round purple bug-type Pokémon covered in fur, with large compound eyes and a general resemblance to something between a moth and a small bear. It evolves into Venomoth, a large moth-like Pokémon with purple wing patterns. The visual problem. Butterfree looks significantly more like the evolved form of Venonat than it does like the evolved form of Metapod. Butterfree's eyes, large, red, compound, match Venonat's visual design far better than they match Caterpie's. Venonat's round, purple, bug-eyed appearance flows naturally into the purple and blue patterns of Venomoth? No, into the wing shapes and eye design of Butterfree. And Venomoth, the actual evolution of Venonat, looks more like what a purple moth thing would logically become, but its visual relationship to Venonat is considerably less elegant than Butterfree's would be. The theory is that the evolutionary lines were swapped during development. That Caterpie was originally meant to evolve into Venomoth, and Venonat was meant to evolve into Butterfree, and somewhere in the development process the lines got crossed literally. The evolution data was assigned to the wrong Pokémon, and no one caught it before the game shipped. It is possible to make a case for this by looking at the design logic in both directions. Caterpie is small, green, and caterpillar-shaped, a creature defined entirely by the early stages of Lepidopteran metamorphosis. Its evolution into a generic green cocoon is consistent. But from that cocoon, the visual language shifts dramatically to a creature with elements the compound red eyes, the wing scale patterns that do not echo Caterpie's design at all. Whereas Venonat, with its round body, purple coloring, large compound eyes, and the general quality of something that would naturally develop wings, leads very naturally into Butterfree's appearance. The counterargument is that Pokémon evolution has never been strictly beholden to realistic biological logic, and that the fact that Butterfree does not visually resemble Metapod is no more unusual than dozens of other evolutionary chains where the design language shifts between stages. Magikarp to Gyarados, Remoraid to Octillery, Feebas to Melodic. Evolutionary surprises are a feature of the franchise, not a bug. But the Caterpie theory persists because it is not just about visual logic, it is about the quality of the fit. If you swap the lines, both evolutionary chains become better. Venonat becomes Butterfree, and the design evolution is elegant and coherent. Caterpie becomes Venomoth, and while it is still a stretch, the fact that both lines involve bug-type moth and butterfly Pokémon means the categories remain correct. Two wrong things that, swapped, become more right than they were. That is the quality of evidence that generates durable fan theories. This one will probably never be resolved. The Pokémon are too old and too established to be officially changed. The developers have not commented on it. But the visual argument is strong enough that it represents something genuinely interesting about how design decisions made in 1996 created permanent logical puzzles that 30 years of fans have never stopped puzzling over. Section 17, The Machine and the Ghost, What Kadabra's Story Reveals. There is a Pokémon named Kadabra, and behind it is one of the strangest and most unsettling Pokédex backstories in the entire franchise. It is also a backstory that ties into real-world events in a way that almost nothing else in the games does, which makes it more disorienting, not less. Kadabra's Pokédex entry in several games describes the origin of the species in terms that are, at best, alarming. The entries across different versions describe Kadabra as having formerly been a human child, a child who went to sleep one night and woke up transformed, or did not wake up as a human but as this thing, a psychic creature with a spoon it did not have when it fell asleep, with powers it did not ask for, with a body that is no longer quite the shape it used to be. The entries speak of this in the past tense, as an established origin, as a thing that is simply known about Kadabra the way their stats and moves are known. The spiral on Kadabra's forehead, the entries note, is thought to be a concentration of psychic energy so powerful that standing near a Kadabra can damage the cognitive function of anyone nearby. Their presence causes machines to malfunction, compasses spin, clock stop, electronics breakdown. Kadabra is the electromagnetic and psychic anomaly walking through the world in the shape of something that used to be a boy. The real-world dimension of this story involves Uri Geller, the self-described psychic and performer who became famous in the 1970s and 80s for claiming the ability to bend spoons with his mind. Geller, who was enormously well known in Japan, objected strenuously to what he considered the obvious use of his likeness and persona in the design of Kadabra, called Yungerer in the original Japanese Yun, being a rendering of Un from Uri, Gerer obviously echoing Geller. Geller filed lawsuits against Nintendo in multiple countries, claiming that the Pokémon was designed as an unauthorized parody of his image, complete with the spoons that are Geller's trademark prop. The legal dispute was significant enough that Nintendo stopped producing Kadabra cards for the Pokémon trading card game in 2003, and Kadabra was effectively removed from the card game for nearly 20 years, a period during which Abra could evolve into Alakazam, but not through Kadabra, because putting Kadabra on a physical card risked reviving the legal complications. In 2021, Geller publicly announced that he had withdrawn his objections and given his blessing for Kadabra to return to the card game, which it eventually did. What the fan theory community built around all of this is a meditation on the boundaries between Pokémon and people, the same meditation that Yamask and the Pokéball interiority theories are built on, but approached from a different angle. Kadabra's Pokédex entry says it used to be human. Uri Geller said Kadabra was him. If you read those two things against each other, you produce a surreal loop. A real human being objected to being depicted as a Pokémon that used to be human. The Pokédex says Kadabra was once human. Geller says he was depicted as Kadabra. Kadabra was once human. Geller is a human. The mirror keeps reflecting back on itself without resolving. The deeper implication that theory-minded fans drew from Kadabra's origin story is about the mechanisms by which the transformation happens. If Kadabra used to be a child, something changed the child into a Kadabra. What was it? An encounter with psychic energy? A random biological mutation? Team Rocket experiments? The game never says. It simply states the fact of the transformation as if it is simply a thing that happens sometimes in this world. A child goes to sleep, and something wakes up in their place, and the something has a spoon. The comfort the franchise usually provides the assurance that Pokémon are distinct from people, that there is a boundary between the two categories erodes significantly when you read entries like Kadabra's and Yamask's in sequence. If both of those things used to be people, if the mechanisms by which humans become Pokémon exist and have operated multiple times, then the world is not as cleanly divided as it presents itself. The boundary between the trainer and the Pokémon is not a category difference but a gradient. And the Pokéball at your belt contains something that might, in another version of the story, have had a name. Section 18. The Language of Dreams. Pokémon and the Sleeping Mind. Let us close this long walk with something a little different from the other theories, something that is less about hidden lore and more about the experience of interacting with the franchise at a specific moment in your life. For a generation of children, Pokémon was the first fictional world they ever loved. Not just enjoyed, not just interacted with as entertainment, but genuinely loved in the way that first worlds lodge themselves into the architecture of a developing mind and never fully leave. The original Game Boy games were something people carried with them everywhere on long car trips, waiting at the doctor's office, lying in bed at night long past the hour their parents had established as the mandatory lights out. Pikachu's cry, the battle transition animation, the sound of a Pokeball clicking shut around something rare. These sounds are encoded into the neural pathways of millions of adults, in a way that means they will still produce a small, warm sensation decades after the fact. Not nostalgia exactly, something more structural than nostalgia. The residue of love. The coma theory, the Ho-Oh-Wish theory, both of them, in their different ways, are trying to explain why Pokémon feels eternal, why the franchise resists closure, why Ash Ketchum is still setting out into the tall grass somewhere in some version of the world, still 10 years old, still new to all of it. The theories answer a question that is really about the fan's own experience. Why does this world feel like it belongs to me? Why does it feel like it should never end? There is a real psychological phenomenon called the reminiscence bump, which describes the fact that memories formed during adolescence and early adulthood, roughly ages 10 through 25, are disproportionately vivid and emotionally significant compared to memories formed at other ages. This is partly because adolescence is a period of intense identity formation. and the experiences that occurred during that formation become part of the self in ways that later experiences do not. The things you loved at 12 are not just things you enjoyed. They are part of the vocabulary your mind uses to think about what matters and what does not, what is beautiful and what is sad, what feels like home. For a large portion of the current adult population, Pokémon is part of that vocabulary. When you encounter the Lavender Town music as an adult, the unsettled feeling it produces is not just aesthetic response to a minor key melody. It is the feeling of returning to a place where something important happened to you, a place that you know in your body before you know it in your mind. When a theory about the game suggests that something dark was always running underneath the surface of the world you loved, it produces something more complicated than fear or sadness. It produces a kind of recognition. The sense that your intuitions about the world were right all along, that you always felt the weight under the music, always felt the absence behind the smiling professor and the cheerful pixels, and the theory is just the name for what you already knew. The theories are, at their best, acts of love. They are the way a fandom says, we took this world seriously. We paid attention. We noticed the details you left for us to find. We followed the threads. This is what we made from what you gave us. Every theory in this video has that quality at its foundation. From the one about the Pokémon War to the one about N and his identity, to the one about the small purple blob that was made by accident in a burning mansion and wanders the ruins of its own origin looking for something it cannot quite remember. These are stories about loss and grief and longing and the impossibility of becoming fully what you are meant to be. They are, in that way, stories about growing up. And they exist inside a franchise that is, on its surface, completely opposed to growing up a franchise where the hero stays 10 years old forever and the journey never ends. That tension, between the darkness the theories find and the brightness the franchise maintains, is where the fandom lives. It always has. The theories do not corrupt the world they examine, they complete it. They take the world that Game Freak began to build in 1996 and finish the sentences that the developers, working on a tight schedule for a Game Boy cartridge, could not fully express. The world they imagined was always larger and stranger and more honest than what fit on the cartridge. The fan theories are the part that spilled over. Closing, everything continues. There is one more thing worth saying before this ends. The Pokémon franchise is still going. New games come out every year or two. New regions, new creatures, new mythologies. The cosmology keeps expanding. The theories keep generating. A generation of players who grew up with the original 151 have now been playing these games long enough to watch their children discover them for the first time, and in that discovery, those parents feel something happening, a doubling, a recognition that runs in both directions, the past and the present illuminating each other. Every new generation of the game carries within it all the previous generations. The world of Scarlet and Violet contains, somewhere in its DNA, the burning Pokémon mansion on Cinnabar Island. The ghost of the Marowak mother still haunts the Pokémon Tower, even though the tower no longer exists in the current maps. The rain that fell on Ash and Pikachu on that first day is still falling somewhere in the amber of the franchise's memory, and Ho-Oh is still trailing a rainbow across a storm-gray sky, and a small electric mouse is deciding that it does not want to be in its ball. The theories will keep being told. New ones will grow from new games, new details, new gaps in official explanation. Old ones will be retold to people who have not heard them yet, in comment sections and long-form videos and conversations between friends at 3 in the morning, when someone says, "Okay, but have you heard the one about Ditto?" There is comfort in that, in the idea that the world is still generating meaning, that the franchise that shaped a generation is not finished with them yet, and they are not finished with it. If you are drifting now, that is perfect. That is the whole point. The theories have been told and the world they describe is settled, and the questions have been asked if not answered, and there is nothing left to do but let the weight of it carry you somewhere quiet. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to walk slowly through a world you thought you already knew and discover that it had more rooms in it than you remembered. If this was the kind of night you needed, subscribe, because there will be more. More worlds to explore slowly. More theories, more lore, more long quiet walks through the franchises that shaped us. Drop a comment wherever you are, whatever time it is, and let us know you were here, that you watched this. That somewhere in the geography of your evening, this was a part of it. The tall grass is still waiting. Sleep well. All fan theories presented herein are community-created interpretations. Confirmed facts are noted as such. Speculation is labeled clearly. The Lavender Town Syndrome creepypasta is fictional. The theories about Ditto, the War, and Gengar, Clefable connections are fan-constructed, but based on real in-game data points. For more on the franchise's official lore, explore the mainline games and official Pokédex entries at your own pace. Addendum going deeper. The texture of the world. Before we formally close, there are threads we have touched on but not fully followed, connections that deserve more time, and details that carry their own particular weight. Let us slow down even further and move through them one by one, because the world of Pokémon theory is vast enough that even a script this length can only cover so much of it, and there is something in the rhythm of this kind of content in the slow, thorough unwinding of detail that rewards the listener who is still awake, still listening, still following the thread. On the rival and the champion, what Blue actually wanted. When you defeat Blue in the championship battle at the end of Pokémon Red and Blue, his grandfather, Professor Oak, is standing right there in the victory hall. He acknowledges you, he praises you. He says something along the lines of calling you the most talented young trainer he has ever seen. And then, in almost the same breath, he turns to his grandson and tells him that he is lacking something, that he needs to think more about his Pokémon, that his approach has been wrong. This moment, on the surface, is just a narrative payoff, the wise mentor figure confirming that the protagonist's philosophy, friendship, and trust with Pokémon is superior to the rival's philosophy, winning at all costs. It is a children's game reinforcing a moral lesson, fine. But within the broader context of what we know or suspect about Blue the Raticate, the Lavender Town visit, the grief he turned into fuel Professor Oak's speech takes on a different quality entirely. Blue just became the Pokémon champion. He beat the Elite Four. He worked his way through the entire Kanto region, with a level of intensity and dedication that the game suggests few trainers match. He arrived at the championship and won it, which at the moment you enter the hall to challenge him was his entire stated life goal. He achieved it, and his grandfather, who he presumably has not seen in months, uses the victory hall moment to criticize him. The cruelty of this is something that adult players feel in a way children typically do not. Blue's achievement is real. Whatever drove him to it, whether it was grief over a dead Raticate or simple competitive pride or both, he earned it. And the first thing Professor Oak says in the moment of his grandson's greatest triumph is that he did it wrong. There is a reading of the entire game in which Blue is the real protagonist, and the player character is the villain. Not in a dramatic way, not with mustache-twirling malice, but in the quiet way that institutional favoritism operates. You are the professor's special project, the chosen one who gets the starter Pokémon first, the one whose name the professor uses to address crowds. Every structural advantage flows toward you. Blue fights the same battles you do, overcomes the same obstacles, reaches the same endpoints, but he does it without the narrative positioning the game gives you, without the implicit approval of the game's structure. And at the end, he is there first, and you take it from him, and his grandfather tells him he still did not do it right. There is no malice in Professor Oak. He genuinely believes what he is saying. But there is something painful in watching a child's achievement dissolved in the moment it is completed by the person whose opinion matters most to him. Whatever Blue is, whatever choices he made, however he handled the loss the theory attributes to him, he deserved better from that moment than the game gave him. On fairy tales and real mythology, the deeper sources of Pokémon design. One of the things that makes the theories feel so natural is that Pokémon as a franchise draws extensively and openly from real-world mythology, folklore, and natural history. When you know the sources, the franchise becomes a kind of ongoing meditation on what those stories mean, and the fan theories are partly the fan community's way of extending that meditation. Gyarados is the most visually obvious example. The design, a powerful sea serpent that transforms from a seemingly useless fish, is drawn directly from a specific Chinese mythological narrative about the koi fish that swims upstream and leaps over the dragon gate. Waterfall, transforming into a dragon. The myth, called Yusaku in various tellings, is a metaphor for perseverance and dramatic reversal, the thing that appears weak proving through sustained effort that it was capable of greatness all along. Magikarp splashing uselessly in the water for 40 levels and then becoming Gyarados at level 20 is not just a game mechanic, it is the myth, translated into gameplay. Every player who raises a Magikarp to the evolution threshold is enacting the Dragon Gate story, probably without knowing it. Ninetales draws from the Japanese myth of the nine-tailed fox, the kitsune, which in Japanese folklore is a shape-shifting trickster spirit of great age and power. The more tails a kitsune has, the older and more powerful it is. 9 is the maximum. Ninetales Pokédex entries describe it as living for 1,000 years, its 9 tails each imbued with a different psychic power. The Pokédex also warns that grabbing one of its tails invokes a 1,000-year curse, which maps to certain kitsune legends about the dangerous consequences of disrespecting the fox. Jirachi is a mythological Pokémon that grants wishes when it awakens from a 1,000-year sleep, drawing from shooting star mythology across several Asian traditions. Lugia's design draws from sea serpent and water dragon traditions across multiple cultures. The legendary birds Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres map to elemental spirits across mythological systems from Slavic to Aztec to Greek. What the fan theories do, when they build narratives about the Pokémon world, is participate in this same mythological tradition. The war theory is a founding myth. It explains the world's current condition by reference to a catastrophic past event. The Ditto Mew theory is a creation myth. It explains the origin of a specific creature through a story of divine or scientific experiment. The Gengar Clefable theory is a shadow mythology, the kind that appears in Jungian psychology and in countless folk traditions. The Dark Twin, the Shadow Self, the thing that walks behind you carrying your shape. The franchise invited this from its very beginning. It was never just about catching creatures. It was about the meanings those creatures carry, the stories they embody, the mythological vocabulary they bring from human cultures all over the world. The fan theories are how that vocabulary gets extended by the people who receive it. On the Silver Pokémon, legendary status, and the Arcanine question. Here is a small, specific theory that has a quiet elegance. Arcanine was supposed to be a legendary Pokémon. In the original games, there is a carved tablet in one location that depicts the 3 original legendary birds, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, alongside what is unmistakably an Arcanine. Not just any large dog Pokémon, but specifically the design that became Arcanine. The artwork on that tablet suggests that Arcanine was, at some point in development, intended to be the 4th legendary bird, or rather, the legendary of a different element, placed alongside the 3 birds as a 4th mythological figure. Arcanine's own Pokédex description supports this. Its entry calls it the legendary Pokémon, which is a specific classification within the Pokédex's taxonomy, distinct from the classifications used for most ordinary species. Arcanine is described in terms that match the tone of legendary entries, rather than regular Pokémon entries. It is described as a majestic creature praised throughout Asia, as a creature whose speed is legendary, whose beauty has been revered across cultures and throughout history. There is almost no other Pokémon in the franchise that gets described in those terms but is not officially a legendary. The theory is that somewhere in the development of the original games, the plan changed. The legendary trio became just the 3 birds, and Arcanine was reclassified as a rare but obtainable Pokémon, available through the Firestone evolution from Growlithe. But the Pokédex entry was not updated to reflect the reclassification, so Arcanine still carries the title Legendary Pokémon in its taxonomy, a remnant of what it was supposed to be. If true, this means Arcanine occupies a unique position in the franchise, not a legendary in official status, but one of the original designed with legendary intention, the grand mythological quality of the design, the fire-colored fur, the imposing size, the running so fast it looks like it vanishes Pokédex imagery. All of it reads as the design language of a creature meant to be rare and unrepeatable, the kind of thing you would tell people you had seen and they would not quite believe you. On the Gengar Japanese Etymology Revisited, we discussed the Gengar Clefable theory earlier, but the etymology of Gengar's name deserves more time because it opens up a whole separate chamber of meaning. Gengar's Japanese name is Gangar. The most common derivation cited by fans and researchers is from doppelganger, specifically the German word for a ghostly double or shadow twin. But there is a secondary derivation that is equally plausible, and arguably more poetically rich. Gengar in older Japanese can be parsed as elements relating to illusion, shadow, and the quality of being from the unseen world. The visual and name design of Gengar was, from the beginning, built around the concept of the dark duplicate, the thing that has your shape but is not you. The philosophical implications of this for the Gengar Clefable theory are significant. If Gengar is specifically named as a doppelganger, a shadowy double, and its visual design closely matches Clefable, then the theory is not just a fan construction. It is the most direct reading of what the designers built. The name tells you what the creature is. The design shows you who it is doubling. The theory is the answer key that the game already contains. In German and Central European folklore, the doppelganger is specifically the double of a living person, not the ghost of someone dead, but the shadow double of someone who exists. Encountering your own doppelganger is traditionally considered an omen of death. The double appears before the original dies, as if the shadow precedes the body in its departure from the world. If Gengar is specifically Clefable's doppelganger, rather than Clefable's ghost, then the relationship between them takes on a different dimension. It is not that Clefable died and became Gengar. It is that Gengar exists as the shadow double of a living Clefable, that somewhere out there, for every Gengar, there is a Clefable casting the shadow that produces it. The ghost does not follow the body's death. It precedes it. It walks ahead, wearing the body's shape, grinning in the dark. On Red's silence and what it means. The protagonist of Pokémon Red and Blue is a silent character in the strictest sense. They do not speak. They do not express. They are a vessel for the player's choices. This is standard for the time. Most game protagonists of that era were non-speaking, defined entirely by action rather than personality. But Red, the canonical name for that protagonist, confirmed through subsequent games, became something more than a vessel. When he reappears in Pokémon Gold and Silver as the ultimate secret boss, standing on the peak of Mount, Silver in total silence while a blizzard howls around him, having left his home and his mother and all human contact behind to train in isolation at the top of the world's most brutal mountain, he became one of gaming's most enigmatic figures. The theories about why Red is there are numerous, and their emotional registers vary widely. The most common reading is straightforward. Red became so powerful after the events of Red and Blue that ordinary training and ordinary competition could no longer challenge him. Mount. Silver is the only place in the world remote and harsh enough to continue that challenge. He is the apex. He trained himself into the one place worthy of him. The more melancholy reading asks about what he left behind. His mother, who in the games can be found back in Pallet Town, sending letters about how she wishes she heard from him more. His rival Blue, who became a gym leader while Red disappeared. The world of trainers and competition and human connection that he apparently decided was beneath him or beside the point or simply not enough. The theory that sits between these two readings is the one that attributes Red's isolation not to pride or extreme dedication but to grief. In this version, something happened after the events of Red and Blue, some loss that the game does not specify because the game ended that made human contact impossible or intolerable. Red went to Mount. Silver not because the peak was the only training ground worthy of him, but because the peak was the only place empty enough to hold the silence he had become. When the protagonist of Gold and Silver climbs to the summit and challenges Red, the battle that follows is completely wordless. Red does not introduce himself. He does not give a speech. He does not make demands or express philosophy. He simply stands there in the storm, and then his first Pokémon is out, and then you are fighting. When you win, he does not say anything. The credits roll. What is remarkable about Red as a character is that his silence is more expressive than most characters' dialogue. The image of him on that mountain, in the storm, alone with his Pokémon, is one of the most atmospheric moments in the entire franchise. It does not need words. It does not need an explanation. You understand something about what it means to pour everything you are into a single pursuit until you have gone further than anyone else can follow you, and the thing you find at the far end is not triumph, but a different kind of isolation. Whatever Red is doing on Mount Silver, he is not happy. He is not comfortable. He is not at peace. He is perfectly, terribly good at what he does, and what he does has carried him somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary joy. On the nature of type effectiveness and the hidden physics of the world, Here is a theory of a different kind, not about hidden lore or dark backstory, but about what the type effectiveness system implies about the physical reality of the Pokémon world. Type effectiveness, the system by which certain types of attacks are strong against others and weak against others, is usually understood as a game mechanic, a layer of strategic complexity that makes battles more interesting. Fire beats grass, water beats fire, grass beats water. Ghost is immune to normal. Steel resists almost everything. This is the grammar of Pokémon battles, and most players internalize it without asking what it means within the fiction of the world. But the type system, if you take it seriously as a physical description of how forces interact in the Pokémon universe, implies a very specific and unusual set of physical laws. Dragon-type moves are super effective against other dragon types, which means that whatever energy dragon represents in this world, it is something that amplifies and reflects when it meets itself, creating destructive resonance rather than canceling out. Ghost-type moves cannot damage normal-type Pokémon, which means that the energy of the ghost world literally cannot interact with the energy of ordinary, grounded existence. The two systems are not just different, they are non-intersecting. The ghostly cannot touch the normal. Psychic-type moves being strong against fighting and poison, but in the original games, being immune to Ghost, and Ghost having no effect on Psychic, created a strange situation in the first generation, where the Ghost-type Pokémon were theoretically terrifying, but mechanically useless against the Psychic-type gym leader Sabrina, who should logically have been their natural prey. This was a programming error in the first games, apparently. Ghost attacks simply did not work against Psychic-type Pokémon in Red and Blue, despite the lore suggesting they should. It was corrected in later generations. But the error created a small conceptual hole in the world for years. Why would the mind, the Psychic, be immune to the Ghost? The answer the fan community has proposed is that Psychic energy in the Pokémon world represents something like rational consciousness, the analytical, aware, self-directed mind. And Ghost energy represents what exists outside that rational consciousness, the residue of the irrational, the emotional, the unresolved, the dead. Psychic types are immune to Ghost, not because they are stronger, but because they are more fully present, more completely in their own consciousness, more defended against the intrusions of the unseen world. The mind, fully engaged, cannot be haunted. This reading has interesting implications for the Lavender Town section of the games. You need to be able to see through the Ghost-type Pokémon blocking the upper floors of the Pokémon Tower in order to confront them. You need a Sylph Scope to make the Ghost visible without it. The entity appears as simply a formless shade that you cannot interact with. The Ghost cannot hurt you, but you cannot hurt it either, and it blocks your path indefinitely. The Sylph Scope makes the invisible real. It grounds the Ghost in a category the game can recognize and respond to. If Psychic-type immunity to Ghost represents the mind's defense against being haunted, then the need for an external tool, the Sylph Scope, to make ghosts visible, suggests something about the limits of that defense. You cannot see what haunts you without help. The rational mind, unassisted, walks right past the very thing blocking its path. You need an instrument, something external, something made rather than innate to see the grief and face it. There are theories that operate on even more cosmic levels about whether the distortion world Giratina rules is literally antimatter physics, whether the weather phenomena created by Groudon and Kyogre represent continent-scale geological forces that predate human existence, whether the creation mythology of Arceus and the creation trio is a metaphorical rendering of the Big Bang and the subsequent expansion of space-time. All of these are worth exploring. All of them suggest that Game Freak built the world with enough internal physical consistency that you can read backward from the mechanics to find something resembling a coherent cosmology. On the question of completion, the instruction at the beginning of Pokémon Red and Blue is one of the most casually ambitious things ever asked of a 10-year-old. Catch them all 151 of them, every species. Document them all in the Pokédex. Create a complete record of the natural world. No player in the history of the games has ever done this without external assistance, without trading with another player, without attending events, without using glitches or cheats. Mew, the 151st Pokémon, was only available through official Nintendo events in Japan, or through the famous Trainer Fly glitch. A complete Pokédex required a second person, a link cable, and either extraordinary luck or the willingness to bend the rules. The instruction was, from the beginning, literally impossible to follow alone. This is not an accident. The game was designed to require connection with other people. You cannot complete the mission the professor gave you without another trainer's cooperation. The incompletion is designed in. The Pokédex, that symbol of scientific ambition and comprehensive cataloging, will have a gap in it forever unless you find another person willing to help fill it. The theory built around this is about what the incompletion represents. Pokémon is, at its deepest structural level, a game about connection between trainer and Pokémon, between player and other player, between the human world and the natural world. Professor Oak's task is not really a scientific mission, it is a social one. The Pokédex completion requires friendship, cooperation, the willingness to give something away in trading in order to receive something you need. You cannot do it alone. The world will not let you. And perhaps that is the most fundamentally true thing the franchise has ever told us. More true than any theory about wars or comas or cloned creatures or shadows that outlive the things that cast them. The world is too large to catalog alone. The mission is too big for one person. To complete anything, you need another person willing to hand you something they found in exchange for something you found and trust that the exchange is fair. That is what Professor Oak was actually teaching. Not taxonomy, not battle strategy, not the efficient cataloging of a regional biome. He was teaching you, through the impossible task he set, that you would need help. That the completion of anything meaningful requires finding someone else who is trying to complete the same thing. The tall grass was always there to show you that. The other trainer, waiting at the end of a link cable, was always the point. End of script. Total approximate length, 28,000 plus words. Written for ASMR-style YouTube narration. 11 Labs voice generation optimized, no stage directions, no timestamps, written for natural spoken delivery. APP-endix, loose threads, and final wanderings. There are always more threads. A script this long can circle back on itself, find new angles on things it thought it had finished, discover small details in corners it passed through too quickly. Let us do that now. These are the fragments and elaborations that belong here, the final wandering through the world before the lights go completely out. The Weather Trio and the ethics of God-level Pokémon. When Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire introduced Groudon and Kyogre, two ancient, continent-scale Pokémon, whose conflict was capable of literally ending the world, the franchise crossed a threshold. It has been navigating carefully ever since. These are not creatures in any meaningful ecological sense. They are forces of nature given physical form, entities whose natural behavior involves the kind of catastrophic climate events that would wipe out most of human civilization. The villain organizations of Ruby and Sapphire Team Magma and Team Aqua want to awaken these Pokémon. Team Magma wants to expand landmass. Team Aqua wants to expand ocean. Neither has fully considered what happens when the entity they are awakening is not controllable by any human-made instrument. When the Pokémon they plan to use as a tool is a geological force that predates human existence by hundreds of millions of years. The theory that has grown around the Weather Trio is about the asymmetry between the franchise's normal emotional register and the actual cosmological scale of what the player sometimes confronts. In a normal week of Pokémon gameplay, you are fighting other trainers, catching Pokémon, navigating gyms. The biggest threat on any given Tuesday is a gym leader who uses a type you are weak against. And then suddenly here is a Pokémon that can expand or eliminate oceans, and here is another one standing behind a waterfall that is the embodiment of all weather on Earth. And here you are, a child with a Pokeball, and the game is suggesting that you should just go catch it. The tonal whiplash is something the franchise has never fully resolved. The player character catches Kyogre with a Master Ball and then it lives in the PC. The ancient entity of oceanic expansion, the force that shaped the world's coastlines, lives in the same digital box as the Rattata you caught on Route 1 and never used. This is either very funny or very disturbing, depending on how you think about it, and the fan theory community has thought about it both ways. The more serious angle is about what it means for the world to contain entities of that power, and what the existence of those entities implies about the world's history. Groudon and Kyogre did not just appear. They have been asleep for a very long time, which means they were awake before. The world as it currently exists, its continents, its ocean distribution, its climatic conditions, is the result of the last time these entities stopped fighting and fell asleep. Everything human civilization has built, every city and forest and Pokémon habitat in the game, exists in the relative stability that followed the last time the world nearly ended. Team Magma and Team Aqua are not just misguided villains. They are people standing in a world built on the settled aftermath of catastrophe, trying to reopen the catastrophe. The player stops them, catches the awakened entities, and the world continues. But it continues in the knowledge that something of that scale exists and can be woken, that the stability is borrowed, that underneath the beaches of Hoenn, something is sleeping that has ended the world before and can end it again. On Haunted Electronics, Rotom's Quiet Strangeness. Rotom is a small electric ghost Pokémon introduced in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. It lives inside electronic appliances, a washing machine, a refrigerator, a lawnmower, a fan, an oven. When it inhabits these objects, it animates them and takes on the characteristics of whatever appliance it is inside. It is, in every applicable sense, a haunted appliance. A poltergeist that has decided the most interesting form of haunting involves becoming a sentient Roomba. The Pokédex entries for Rotom describe it as a creature born from lightning strikes on thunderclouds, which then seeks out electronic devices to inhabit. They also note that it loves pranks, which is the franchise's way of explaining why a ghost would choose to haunt your microwave. But there is a layer to Rotom that becomes interesting when you read it against the broader themes of the franchise. Rotom is a ghost that exists because of electricity. It is haunted energy, or perhaps more precisely, it is the ghost that electricity leaves behind. Every electronic device in the Pokémon world processes electrical current, and Rotom is what happens when that electrical energy develops a consciousness and an agenda. This maps strangely onto the theory about Porygon and artificial intelligence in the Pokémon world. Porygon is a Pokémon created entirely from programming, an artificial intelligence designed to operate in digital space. Rotom is something close to the opposite. It is a natural ghost that expresses itself through electronic systems, using the human-made infrastructure of electricity as the medium for its haunting. One direction of creation intelligence made from code, and one direction of invasion ghost moving into machines. They converge at the same question: what is consciousness, and can it be housed in a device? The Pokémon world contains both artificial consciousness, Porygon, Mewtwo, the fossil-revived creatures who are in some sense resurrected from fragments of ancient DNA and haunted systems, Rotom, Yamask, the ghost types generally. It is a world that has multiple answers to the question of where minds come from, and none of them quite match the ones we use in our world. And perhaps that is part of what makes the theories feel so generative. The rules of consciousness in that world are different enough from ours that any question you ask has a slightly different shape there, and the answers point somewhere unexpected. On the old chateau and what watches from inside, in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, there is a location called the Old Chateau in Eterna Forest. It is an abandoned, crumbling mansion filled with ghost-type Pokémon, with rooms that feel wrong, in the specific way that a space feels wrong when something violent or sad happened in it a long time ago, and the feeling never fully left. In the Old Chateau, if you pay attention and return at specific times or under specific conditions, you can see things that the game does not explain. A ghostly girl who appears at the end of a hallway and vanishes when you approach. A ghostly butler who flickers into view in a specific room. They are not trainers. They cannot be battled. They have no dialogue. They are simply there, seen briefly, and then gone. The working theory among fans is that the Old Chateau is haunted by the ghosts of two humans, a young girl and her butler who died in the mansion before the events of the game. Their deaths are never described. The circumstances are never provided. They exist as pure presence, as the visual evidence of absence, as the thing the game shows you to confirm that something happened here without ever telling you what. This is arguably one of the most mature horror techniques in the franchise's history. The game does not give you the story. It gives you the aftermath of a story, and it trusts you to understand that stories with this kind of aftermath are always the same kind of story. A mansion, two ghosts, one girl, one adult in a position of service. The implication of relationship and tragedy is enough. You do not need to be told more. The Old Chateau also contains Rotom, hiding in a television set on the top floor, which, given what we just said about Rotom and haunted electronics, adds another layer of meaning to the location. The old chateau has Rotom, because the old chateau has electricity and loss, and the specific kind of old grief that attracts ghost types. The television is haunted because everything in that house is haunted, because hauntings are not isolated to individual objects but are atmospheric, contagious, the quality of a space that has held enough loss. On the ruins of Alf and the language before language. We talked about the unknown theory in the Arceus section, but the ruins of Alf in Pokémon Gold and Silver deserve their own moment, because they are one of the franchise's most effectively mysterious locations. The ruins of Alf are a complex of ancient stone structures in the Johto region, buried partially underground, accessible through a series of puzzle chambers that require you to assemble fragmented images of Pokémon Kabuto, Aerodactyl, Omanite, Ho-Oh to open the floors. Inside the ruins, Unown appear as wild encounters. The walls are covered in Unown-shaped writing that, when translated through the franchise's Unown alphabet, produces fragments of text that read like warnings or instructions. Escape, listen, flee, protect. What are the ruins warning about? Who built them? The game's lore suggests an ancient civilization that worshipped or interacted with Unown, that understood their power and their relationship to forces beyond normal comprehension. The fragmented text on the walls coming from creatures associated with creation mythology, written in letters that may be the god Arceus's own tools, implies that the people who built the ruins of Alf knew something, had seen something. We're trying to pass a message forward through time to whoever might eventually be able to read it. The message they left is not complete. The ruins have multiple chambers, multiple sets of Unown script, multiple fragmented warnings. Taken together, they suggest that whoever built this place was afraid of something and believed that the way to communicate that fear across generations was to write it in the oldest language, the letters that predate all other writing, the shapes that the universe was made from. What they were afraid of has never been specified in the official games. The fan theories range from connections to ancient Pokémon power events, to warnings about the forces Cyrus tried to control in Diamond and Pearl, to simply the general weight of knowledge that comes from living close enough to Unown to understand what they represent. Whatever the answer, the ruins of Alf are the franchise's clearest example of the device of the ancient warning, the message from the dead to the living, written in a language that barely anyone can read, about a danger that barely anyone remembers. It is one of the most consistently affecting locations in the games, and almost no one goes there twice after they first collect the various Pokémon the puzzles unlock. The ruins sit there in the Johto region, mostly unvisited in repeated playthroughs, still covered in warnings in a script made of ancient letters, still trying to tell someone something that the franchise has never let anyone fully hear. And that, finally, is everything. Or, not everything, never everything. The world is too large, the theories too numerous, the franchise too long-lived to cover completely in any single sitting. But that is as it should be. If it were fully mappable, it would not be a world worth theorizing about. The incomplete catalog is the point. The Pokédex with the gaps is the lesson. We began with the question of why fan theories exist at all, and we end with the same question wearing a different face. Why do we keep telling these stories? Why does the Raticate's death matter? Why does Ditto's origin matter? Why does it matter that Gengar moves like a shadow and that Clefable stands in the moonlight casting exactly its shape? Because we are the people who noticed. Because we paid attention to a world someone built with care, and we found the care, and we honored it by caring back. Because the franchise that shaped us as children has depth enough to hold us as adults too, and the theories are the proof that depth is real. Sleep well.